good to go. Thank you, everybody, for being a little patient there as we get things set up. We're just going to call the meeting
Recording in progress.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the special council meeting for November the 19th. November the 16th. Yes, November the 16th. I'm losing track of my own time. I just want to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional territories of the Coast and the Straits Salish peoples, specifically the Lekwungen-speaking people known today as the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations, and that their historic connections to these lands continue to this day. Up first, we have approval of the agenda for this meeting. Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Not seeing any. All those in favor? Opposed? None opposed. Then we have our special meeting matters in front of us. I just have a couple of quick housekeeping pieces for everybody who's watching, participating, or other. First off, Councillor Zelka sends his apologies. He works for Emergency Management BC, and there's a lot going on there right now. So unfortunately, he's been seconded essentially to extra work this evening and is unable to make this meeting. I did reach out to him just to get some sense of his thoughts, so I'll interject occasionally through the course of the evening with things that he told me, so I can share that with everyone. Procedurally tonight, obviously we're trying to give some as clear direction as possible to staff so they can start developing details of the suite regulation policy, if that's the direction of council. So I just thought I'd go over the timeline that I was going to work on here. It is open to the public, and we are welcoming public input. So just to keep things reasonably tidy tonight, I'm going to have Lou Varela do a brief introduction, then Dan Wong from Urban Systems will be presenting. At that point, I'm going to invite the public to comment. If there's anybody who's watching who wishes to speak, can do so. There's a 1-855 number on the agenda package. If you call in and hit *9, that will raise the hand and we'll take your calls. Or if you're in the Zoom meeting, you can also reach us through that. And then after public comment, we'll come back to council and we'll walk through those individual items, have debate, discussion on those individual pieces, and then at the end we'll have the motion that's at the top of the agenda, which is basically to recommend approval of those policies as a complete piece. So I hope that's reasonably clear. And with that, I am happy to hand this over to Ms. Varela, our Chief Administrative Officer.
Thank you, Your Worship. So as most of you know, the official community plan policy says to develop a policy and regulatory framework to permit secondary suites as a way of providing affordable housing. That was a 2014 document, and in 2018, Council embarked on a secondary suite study, and Urban Systems has been instrumental in advancing that along. There's been a lot of public engagement, a lot of reports to Council, a lot of great feedback, and most recently, Council received the secondary suite study final strategy in open meeting, and at that meeting, we flagged 10 draft guiding attributes that Council could consider for staff to go and base implementation of a secondary suites program on, should Council choose to do so. The final strategy included a review and analysis of regulatory and program considerations, including zoning, parking, licensing, the building code, infrastructure and servicing, and staff resourcing. So tonight, the matter at hand, there's 10 draft guiding attributes for Council, and we're looking for some very high-level guidance on if this is the way Council wants to proceed. We're not looking for tools or solutions to things such as how a regulatory or a registration program could be achieved. We're going to bring that back to Council at a future decision point, but we need direction to say you actually want a registration program, and then we could bring those things back to you. So the 10 attributes that we're talking tonight about is we're seeking Council direction on addressing both new and existing secondary suites in Oak Bay, that secondary suites be incorporated into all one-family residential use zones in Oak Bay, that no minimum lot size be required to have a secondary suite, no maximum unit size be required to have a secondary suite, owner occupancy be a requirement to have a secondary suite, and that either a secondary suite or a boarding use may be permitted, and that one additional off-street parking space be required. Enforcement of secondary suites would be through a complaint basis, and that basic health and safety standards should be met for existing suites based on alternate compliance methods with the BC Building Code, and that full BC Building Code compliance should be required for no suites, or for new suites, sorry, and further that a registration program be utilized. So we'll be looking for council's high-level guidance on that. I'd also like to flag that after council's direction at the last meeting, the Advisory Planning Commission met on November 2nd to provide feedback on 3 specific attributes: parking, owner occupancy, and the registration program. I wanted to point out that the recommendations of staff and the APC generally align with regards to owner occupancy and ensuring that a registration program is in place. The recommendation of the APC differs from the staff recommendation regarding the provision of off-street parking, as the APC's recommendation is to require no additional off-street parking. And we're looking for council's direction on those 10 draft guiding attributes. Thank you, Your Worship. I'm going to hand it over to Dan, with your permission, to walk us through this presentation. I'd also like to thank Dan and Urban Systems for their extensive work on this strategy to date. This does mark the conclusion of the contract with Urban Systems, so I think that's important for council to know. And again, a big thank you to Dan and Urban Systems for the work.
Thank you, Ms. Rella, and welcome, Mr. Wong. I guess that means the longer we keep him here tonight, the better value we're getting for our dollar. Is that how this works?
Sorry about that, Dan.
Welcome. Nice to have you here this evening.
Thank you, Your Worship, members of council. I'm pleased to be here in person actually this evening. I was having a few microphone issues last time, so it's nice to be here both in person, and hopefully the technology will cooperate with me this evening. I've got about a dozen slides in the presentation, and that's on the screen, and looking forward to a good discussion tonight about secondary suites. So the next slide, please. So as Ms. Farella mentioned, the official community plan in 2014 identified a housing policy towards and regulatory framework towards permitting secondary suites as a way of providing affordable housing. She also mentioned that this project that we were commissioned to undertake began in 2018. It was a 5-phase project and culminated with our presentation of the final strategy report to council in September of 2021. That report that was provided for information presented a framework for consideration for various secondary suites attributes, which we're here to discuss this evening. At that meeting, council received the report and requested additional feedback from APC on those 3 guiding attributes: owner occupancy, additional off-street parking, and a voluntary registration program. And we presented that to APC on November the 2nd. So as mentioned at APC, there was discussion about owner occupancy, and there was general support for owner occupancy. The minutes will show after a really good discussion, there were 2 APC members who were opposed to owner occupancy because it could provide potential additional barriers. And so, but at the end of the day, they did support in general the requirement for owner occupancy. However, their recommendation to council was for consideration of a potential to review its function after the secondary suites regulations have been implemented. In addition, the proposed framework would require owner occupancy in either the suite or the principal dwelling unit. And as mentioned in previous presentations, this would require some further legal review for specific wording in the zoning bylaw. However, there is some recent case law in the resort municipality of Whistler, which does seem to favor a local government's ability to zone for user. With respect to parking regulations, on the next slide, please. Off-street parking is a challenging and well-discussed topic within the community, and it does vary by neighborhood and sometimes even varies on a block-by-block basis. Based on the community feedback and the comparison communities in our report, we're proposing some potential text amendments to the Oak Bay Parking Facilities Bylaw to require 1 additional off-street parking space for the secondary suite. As mentioned to council in the past, an applicant could apply for a variance to council on a case-by-case basis to relax the parking requirements based on localized conditions. Another good discussion with APC was held, And APC felt that given the potential impact to site landscaping, and the tree canopy, and the climate crisis, APC has recommended no additional off-street parking be required. With respect to registration, based on the feedback to date, there has been a mixed response between the requirement for either a voluntary or a mandatory registration program. And the mandatory registration program could also include business licensing. A highly regulated registration program with business licensing could require additional resources and may be prohibited for additional initial uptake into the program. Again, following a good discussion with APC, they weren't in favor of a voluntary registration program. They were also not in favor of a mandatory registration program, but they did, however, recognize the importance of collecting data on secondary suites, as well as having that data to assist in improving health and safety conditions in the suites as applicable. So following discussion, APC has recommended that a registration program be utilized for tracking suites in Oak Bay. Finally, when we met with council last time, and as part of our final strategy report, we had identified 5 communities for review and comparison of those secondary suite attributes. Those were the Town of Sydney, District of Saanich, Township of Esquimalt, District of West Vancouver, and the City of Chilliwack. At that October meeting, council had suggested that we further contact them again, and which we were able to contact 4 of the 5 communities, and to have a bit more discussion with respect to their secondary suite experiences. And the next slides indicate a combination of some numerical data that they provided, plus some anecdotal information based on our telephone phone call. So for the Town of Sydney, secondary suites have been legal since 1996, not 2008, as per our report. As of March 2021, they indicate that there are 526 known secondary suites, and this is from BC Assessment. 135 of those are regulated, and the remaining are unregulated. New secondary suites in the Town of Sydney have a high compliance. There has been a bit of a slower uptake for existing suites. They get a few of them a year. However, based on complaints, suites overall have not been an issue in the town, and that's anecdotal information. They are looking at revising their water utility billing now on a per unit basis. And the town policies in general are moving towards gentle density and distributed affordable housing. For the District of Saanich, since legalization, the planner indicated that there have been approximately 600 building permits for secondary suites. 50% of those are brand new houses with suites, 33% are renovations to an existing home, and 15% are additions to an existing home for secondary suites. There have been no data specifically collected regarding the total suites in the community. However, on anecdotal observation, there's a potential high-level estimate that 1 in 3 single-family dwellings has a suite within Saanich. New suites have high compliance to regulations, and again, similar to Sydney, there's a bit of a slower uptake for existing suites. Also, with respect to complaints, secondary suites have not been an issue in recent years, and the district is moving towards, again, additional gentle density with policies respecting coach houses, garden suites, and so forth. For the District of West Vancouver, they're the only one of the 5 communities, comparison communities in our report that has a registration process. This entails a $495 initial fee plus an annual fee. Discussion with the Director of Planning there has indicated that registration has not been an issue with respect to cost, nor has secondary suites been an issue in general, again, based on complaints or lack thereof. There were no other statistics available at this time, and the District of West Vancouver is currently reviewing its regulations to further encourage infill housing, such as coach houses, as well as they're also considering additional reductions to its parking regulations to encourage infill housing. And finally, for the comparison communities, we discussed with the City of Chilliwack. They're one of the 5 comparison communities. They're a bit unique in that as of 2018, they have taken a policy of non-enforcement for all suites before that date. And so as such, they don't tabulate any statistics on unregulated suites, but all suites built since May of 2018 are required to be legal and follow the regulations of the City of Chilliwack with respect to building code, their floodplain bylaw, and so forth. And there's been high compliance for new suites based on those regulations. So in summary, Your Worship, the secondary suites study builds upon a long history of community discussion in Oak Bay, a number of policy considerations, and research. The staff report in front of you identifies a series of draft secondary suites guiding attributes to be considered and endorsed by Council to provide policy direction in support of implementing a secondary suites program in Oak Bay. Like any program, it can be reviewed, adjusted, and improved over time. We believe that secondary suite implementation is just one step in securing the diversity of the housing supply in Oak Bay and contributing towards addressing the critical housing challenges within the capital region. Thank you for the opportunity to work in Oak Bay, and looking forward to the discussion tonight.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wong. And I'm going to make the call out to the public if anybody wishes to address council. If you're attending through the Zoom meeting, please just raise your hand through the reactions tab at the bottom. Or if you're called in to listen through that mechanism, or watching the live stream through YouTube, then you can use the phone number and access code at the bottom of your screen as you're watching it. I believe the passcode today is 030909. To make sure we have the right one on the screen. Again, that number is 030909. And I'll just give a moment for people to call if they wish to speak to us. I may just, given the vagaries of our technology, I'll probably do another call a little bit later in the meeting, but we'll try and get the comments in now as much as possible before we start delving into the details of the options in front of us. Just going to give this another 30 seconds or so. Should we see anybody who wishes to call and speak to us? We have, over the course of the last 2.5 years, had a number of bits of correspondence that have come our way to give guidance, as well as, of course, the survey and other public input models that we've used to help guide this. And I guess I should point out as well, as has been pointed already, that this is the direction point. We make a decision here in terms of where our direction is. There's still a lot of work to do to get to the finalization of the policies and pieces that could come in. And I think those policies will have a major impact in terms of how much uptake we get from the public and so forth, because how we structure those compliance pieces obviously makes a big difference in the overall piece within this framework. Staff, if I can ask, is there anybody who's indicated online that they would like to speak? Okay, that's fine. So as I laid out at the beginning, I think what I'm going to do, I will take, if anybody wishes to make any sort of general comments, we can take them now, but the plan here is to walk through each of the line items. Well, I think procedurally the simplest is just to move the motion that's here, and then if we want to change that, then we can either defeat it or amend it as appropriate. We'll call questions on each of those. These are, again, recommendations. And then at the end, we'll do that suite be endorsed, and then again we can have that debate, and again we can make amendments to what's included in that at the end. So procedurally, that's the way I'd like to move forward. Is there anybody who wishes to have any general comments before we start going through these line by one? I saw Councilor Nady, do you wish to?
Mr. Mayor, I don't know if this, but I just have a question, Mr. Wong, based on the presentation, or should I wait until what I was going to ask comes up as an issue in the list of things we're going through? Your preference?
I think the preference is to deal with them in that line, but if you think it might have an impact on the broader overall piece, the suite of the things, then you can ask the question now.
I can wait.
Councilor Patterson, you had something you wished to?
Yes, Mayor, thank you. Just a question for Mr. Huang. In the presentation, Mr. Huang, you referred to improvements or changes could occur over time, and that seems quite logical. But I know in the previous presentation you touched on once the program was implemented, then for some changes it might in fact create a situation where you could have legal non-conforming status for suites, just as you might for implementation of building permits where conditions changed and a condition might be legal non-conforming. Is there any example you could like, where do you get that basis of you could improve or change, or where it might actually be an obligation upon what we adopt tonight, creates a situation where if we wanted to change it in the future, it might, in fact, sort of be grandfathered for whatever we do tonight. Is there kind of a generalization on?
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Mr. Wong.
Thank you, Worship. Through you to Councillor Patterson. So it depends on which component. So if it's use-based, and so for example, the very first one, if council does decide to endorse that secondary suites are a permitted use within new and within, let's say, RS1 zones, and if you make that change to the zoning bylaw, if you decide to change that after the fact, then that use that existed at the time is legally non-conforming. Other things that you may change within here with respect to, say, minimum lot size or maximum unit size, again, if you change some of those things, depending on those that are in place at the time, if you change those could be legally non-conforming as well too. Other things which are more policy related or with respect to the registration program, those things could be changed or amended over time, and those wouldn't have necessarily those components to it. And so it really comes down to those things with respect to use, permitted uses within, I would suggest, the zoning bylaw. Those things that, once those are changed, anything that is changed after the fact, if it was in existence and if it was legal at the time, it becomes legal non-conforming. If that changes or ceases to exist, according to the legislation, then that would come into play at that time. So.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Wong. Any other sort of general questions that we can touch on before we delve into these? So if I may just go through there, so I think what I would take here is just a motion to recommend that in the first case, the secondary suites program address both new and existing secondary suites. Then we can talk to that, debate it, and
I'll make that motion.
moved and seconded. Thank you. Thank you. So it's moved and seconded. Discussion on this item, for or against, and once we complete debate on this, I'll call the question and move on to the next one. Mover, any comments on this? Okay, I think this is one.
Excuse me, Mayor.
Yeah, go ahead, Councillor Green.
Excuse me, are you taking general comments on the issue itself?
Well, I think we're going to move these as motions, so I'd sort of speak to you as, if you want to speak to new and existing, then that's appropriate to do at this time. If you want to have a
Yes,
general comment, I'll take that as well. Just we're early enough in the meeting. I'm open to that as well.
Well, I have general comments, but I could make those at the end or during the process. I just wondered what you would like.
I think just procedurally, it's simplest if we go through these one by one, and then we can consider sort of how that looks at the end in terms of an overall package, and then we can have a discussion on that overall package if there's things that aren't captured. But I think, given that we have to make these, we're really dealing with these individual policies, it's easiest to have the debate on the individual pieces. So I'll leave it to you.
Well, I may as well make my comments now because I will be supporting the first motion. And I just have a few comments I'd like to make that I prepared. It's hard to do it from a distance. I'm sorry, I'm not in the room. But here are my conclusions based on all of the material that's been provided. And thank you, Mr. Wong, again for your comprehensive reports and your willingness to come back and also discuss the APC meeting. I was in attendance as an observer, as were others, and it was very helpful to hear their conversation. At a time when housing is suffering critical shortages and limited supply.
Councillor Green, sorry, I think if there's just a general comment piece, let's get through the individual pieces, and then we'll take the comments on the whole at that time. I think it's appropriate.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and it seems very self-explanatory, but I'm going to ask it anyways. It says both new and existing. How will we differentiate that? Is it? I mean, we don't really have any that are existing. So, does this mean new, like in new construction with a suite put in, or in essence, when we start the program, are they all new?
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. It's always worth asking those kinds of questions to make sure we're all on the same page. Go ahead, Mr. Wong.
Thank you, Your Worship. The intent of that is, yes, new construction versus existing construction. That's correct, yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Councillor Nay.
Just a point of clarity. So does this, it includes both new and old, as has just been defined for existing secondary suites, but how does how do existing suites what is the uptake process for existing suites? Like, would they be expected to comply within a certain period of time, or how much grace period, or how does that detail get worked out?
Sure, and that is our follow-on policy piece, but go ahead, Mr. Wong, if you can talk to some of that.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll start, and if Ms. Farrell would like to add anything. So the thought was, and it actually probably relates more to number 2, is that the all RS zones would be added to it, the permitted use of a secondary suite, full stop. And so then that allows an as-of-right use of a secondary suite. And so if it's a brand new construction, somebody would come in, and then as of right, they have the ability to build that secondary suite as a permitted use. They would have to follow the building code for that. If it is an existing home and it has a suite in it that was currently unregulated, and that person wanted to legalize that suite, the use is permitted. They would then come into the district for a building permit to then legalize that suite, and then based on number 9 on the list, they would then have to comply with, for existing suites, the alternate compliance method through Division A. So essentially, it's just, the zoning bylaw change just allows for suites as an as-of-right use, and then it's how you then implement that, I guess, is part of the discussion.
Go ahead,
Just
Councillor
to
Nay.
follow up for further clarity, so does that mean it's voluntary for existing secondary suites to comply with the new bylaw? It's for, so what happens if a homeowner chooses not to actively comply with the new regulation?
Go ahead, Mr. Wong.
Thank you. Through your worship, the intent of attribute number 8 is that enforcement of that suite is through a complaint-based program. And so if that suite, if the zoning text amendments are in place, that is a permitted use. No active enforcement would happen unless there was a complaint base. And then if the district then chose to act on that complaint, then the use is still allowed, but it would have to then comply to at least Division A of the alternate compliance method.
Just another question, Mr. Mayor. So I know sometimes some communities have given a grace period. So say there was a homeowner who was wanting to do that, but they didn't have the finances to comply right away, and it was brought to the attention of the municipality. Is it feasible to include some kind of grace period for existing secondary suites to mitigate how onerous it may be for some homeowners?
Mr. Wong, is that level of detail over here tonight, or is that, I'll let you answer the question anyway, but.
Thank you. Through your, I'll start, and again, if Ms. Varela would like to add as part of the implementation, the grace period in some communities that have used it is when they would then actively seek to enforce some of those. And so there is no active enforcement as part of this package of attributes that we're proposing. With those communities that have said, yes, we'll give you either a year to register and then we'll go and actively enforce that. But at this stage, it's not. And so if a complaint does come in front of council, council can determine on a case-by-case basis how you want that suite to be brought into compliance. And you may give a time period at that time. So you could give 6 months or a year for that person to come into compliance to the bylaw based on that complaint at the time. So, but I'll defer to staff for, that's a little bit beyond me as far as implementation is concerned.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. And just as a follow-up on that, perhaps Ms. Varela can answer this, or other members of the staff that are watching. For a typical case of a code violation, is there a standardized requirement for code compliance? On like if we went out and we saw something that or the inspectors went out and saw something that violated code, I mean, I don't think they just say, that's it, cease, and you can't do this anymore. There is always a time period, is there not, for complying with the requirement of the code?
Mr. Wong?
Certainly, Your Worship. As mentioned in previous presentations, the building code used to only have one code, and so the compliance were based on minimum ceiling height for the most part for suites. Secondary modes of egress are generally part of the code. There are fire separation components as well too, as well as smoke alarms. And so currently the fire department and the building department work with current homeowners to at least bring that basic level of health and safety. Even though current suites are unregulated, they still work with homeowners to try and bring it up to kind of at least that minimum health and safety. The code now has recognized that because of the housing shortage, they brought in this alternate compliance method. So this does provide a regimented approach that the building department can actually use when they go in and relax some of those things like building heights, egress, and those other components. So.
Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Green, then Councillor Braithwaite.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mayor, and through you to Mr. Wong. Mr. Wong, just a one question. You just briefly mentioned it, but in my research, I also learned that egress is one of the key public safety issues for existing suites, especially for all suites generally. And I just wondered, what is your experience in that regard in terms of existing suites in particular to ensure that they have egress points for public safety? If you have any comments, I'd sure appreciate hearing them. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. Mr. Wong?
Through your worship, we've, as part of this study, we've had discussions with the building inspector. I don't have a lot of specific details with respect to, case examples, but certainly there's as far as egress, you are required to provide a separate entrance, and then the other component of egress with respect to if there's a sleeping area, there's a size of window that's required. And so if you can comply to those, provide that unencumbered access in and out of the unit, and then comply with the size of window within the sleeping area, that's generally the two areas of egress that the building inspector looks at. So, but if there's any staff that want to add to that, I'd appreciate that.
I think it's sufficient for tonight's meeting. Councillor Green, anything else?
Just thank you for the clarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green.
I think that's helpful information for any homeowners who might be listening in.
I'll go to Councillor Braithwaite and Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Mayor. And so just to go on something that Councillor Ney brought up about the time to comply, and you mentioned that that it could be, anything from a year to 2 years or whatever it might happen to be, but you also said that it comes on at a different stage. Do we know what stage that might come on? Like, I don't think that's something we're deciding tonight. If that was something that we were choosing, is to have a time limit to comply, but that would come at a later date, but not tonight. Is that correct? Just to clarify.
Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. Go ahead, Mr. Wong.
Thank you, Your Worship. As part of this package of attributes, there was no timeline set at this stage, and so it would be up to council and through staff at time of implementation to determine if a timeline was even warranted at that time.
Thank you very much. And I do, thank you for all those clarifying questions. Councillor Patterson?
Yes, thank you. And my question was very similar to Councillor Braithwaite's. It was just that we're only making the decision on the what, and the how comes the next piece. Is that correct?
Largely correct, yes. So with that, I don't see any other hands up on this item. We have a motion to recommend that the policy affect both existing and new suites. Any other discussion?
moved.
Oh, it's been moved and seconded already, Councillor Green. So we're just now speaking to the motion. Don't see any other discussion, so I'll call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. And so I'll review these at the end as we go through, as we look at the policy as a whole. So the next would be, if we can just get someone to read out the motion that's laid here, which is be incorporated into all RS zones.
I'll move that secondary suites be incorporated into all RS one-family residential use zones in Oak Bay.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Thank you very much for that. Are there questions or discussion on this item? This would effectively allow for everything from large lots to small lots to have access to suites as an option. Don't see any comments or questions, so I'm happy to call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed? That carries. Thank you very much. Then the next one is no minimum lot size.
I'll move that.
I'll move that motion.
Second.
Moved and seconded. So just for clarity of those at home, I just want to make sure we're clear. This is basically moving recommendation that no minimum lot size be required to allow for a secondary suite. Are there any questions of Mr. Wong or comments on this motion? I'm just going to ask the general question, and Mr. Wong, in your experience, has this ever come back to bite anybody on that? It seems like a reasonable approach just because we can't anticipate oddities, and there's natural limitations to any housing size to have a suite. But is there any sort of risks here that we should be aware of before we consider this?
Through your worship, because of the other regulations, lot coverage, parking requirements and others, there is no limitation to this attribute. Restrict or consider, there's no issue with this attribute.
Thank you for that. Any other discussion on the motion? Not seeing any, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? None opposed? That moves forward as suggested. And the next one, no maximum unit size. Moved by Councillor Green, seconded by Councillor Nay. Thank you. Discussion? The hesitancy of hands going up makes me think there might be some discussion. Go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite. Not seem very.
Hello? Hello? I'm sorry, I've lost all of you. I think I can hardly hear you.
Yeah, we're just having a microphone issue in the chamber here, so. Oh, I see why here, because it's top of mine.
We'll get. Thank you, Mayor Murdoch. Yes, this is the one that I'm just not sure about this one. So when it says that there's no maximum unit size to be required, so that would mean that, to me, that the secondary suite could actually be larger than the part that the owner occupier would be residing in. So is that, I mean, I probably don't have a difficulty with this, but it's just, I just would like a little bit more of an explanation around it, just to clarify again, because I've kind of forgotten from our last conversation exactly how that works.
And perhaps, Mr. Wong, you could just touch on, I know other jurisdictions, some cases have 40%, the old rules limited it to 40% or a certain square footage, and that's been dropped as a requirement. And maybe just touch on those former requirements and current best practices.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to Councillor Braithwaite. Yes, the previous building code did have a regulation that said that suites were to be a maximum of 90 square meters or 40%. of the size of the residence, whichever was greater. That regulation has since been dropped, and so some communities still have those requirements. Some have taken one out. There was previous discussion about not having the square meter size, but keeping 40% or maybe even 49% so that it is ancillary. And so under this attribute, there was no maximum unit size being proposed. But as you said, it could be larger, but you would leave it up to owner's discretion to say, well, if I'm building a suite, I probably wouldn't make it larger than my principal dwelling. So.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you. And just a question for Mr. Wong. When we're talking about the suite here, we are talking about a suite that is an integral part of the dwelling, not living quarters that might be attached by a breezeway or, creative use of the space.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Mr. Wong?
Thank you, Worship. The terms of reference of our engagement on this study was to look at suites within the existing, within the building footprint of the unit, so it wouldn't be classified as either a coach house or something in a garage. As far as a breezeway, I guess I would have to look at how it was defined, but the intent was that it was going to be was part of the structure of the building itself.
Thank you. Any other discussion on this item? I don't see any other hands, so in the process here, the motion is on here to, there's no maximum size. Essentially gives the maximum size of 50%. Is there any other, I guess it doesn't really, could be any size. Is there any other discussion on this? If not, I'll call the question. Not seeing any. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed? That carries.
I'll move that the owner occupancy be, I'll move that owner occupancy be a requirement to have a secondary suite within a single family dwelling in Oak Bay.
I'll second that.
Moved and seconded. Is there discussion on that item? Go ahead, Councillor Patterson, then Councillor Appleton.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and perhaps Mr. Wong can comment on this. And I know that we still have to talk about how this would be done, but I'm presuming some sort of a declaration would be required for owner occupancy. In the event that the ownership of the building transfers, what would typically happen in other districts where that took place? Would there be a requirement then that to have a continuation of the use of the suite, the new owner would have to, in fact, come in and make a declaration, or just general guidelines around that?
So thank you, Councillor Patterson.
Through your worship, so the owner occupancy text would be text that would be written into the zoning bylaw, which would require that that there be owner occupancy to it. We're getting into a bit of the how, I guess you would enforce that. Some communities, as you noted, Councillor Patterson, have used a declaration, so then that declaration could be reinstated. But others, a lot of other communities don't use that declaration, and then they would deal with it on a complaint basis. So.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship. Speaking against this motion, I'm not in favor of this requirement. I concur with the members of the Advisory Planning Commission that raised the issue of barriers to housing. I think that there is a bit of a negative connotation associated with this type of requirement, in that folks that may be renting or occupying a suite in some way sort of need to be monitored, or there needs to be some sort of oversight over folks that might be renting. I think that even if both units, even if the primary unit and the suite are being rented, these are all neighbors and community members who will engage with the community. I don't foresee problems that would arise from the owner not being on site. So I'm not in favor of this requirement.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Councillor Nay?
Yeah, I'm struggling with this one for similar reasons that Councillor Appleton's just expressed. And so I do have a question through you, Chair, to Mr. Wong. So if I've understood this, one of the rationales for this provision is because it reduces the ability for housing speculation and investment property. So I'm failing to understand how, whether the person's an owner or an dictates speculation, because people could still speculate whether it's single family with or without a suite and rent the whole house out. So I don't quite, like, is there evidence to show that increase it, that if you were to not have owner occupancy for secondary suites, that it would induce speculation of these properties as investment over and above if it was just a single family home?
Thank you,
And
Councillor.
what is the logic of that, please?
Thank you, Councillor Nay. Go ahead, Mr. Wong.
Through your worship, to Councillor Nay and to Councillor Appleton, very good comments and very good discussion. There isn't a lot of hard data in that, so there is a lot of kind of anecdotal thoughts and possible emotion in that. You know, if you are an owner, then you are more vested in that property, and if there are issues, then you will take care of them right away, as opposed to renters. You know, whether that's been proven out, you know, there aren't a lot of studies in that respect. It really comes down to, I suppose, you know, maybe some historical perceptions in that frame. The structure of owner occupancy also probably came historically with the quote-unquote mortgage helper conversation as well too. And so again, somebody looking to own a house and get into the housing market. And so those are those conversations that have kind of led a lot of the comparison communities to kind of enter into the foray with respect to owner occupancy. There are you know, arguments you know, for that and against that. It really depends on you know, how you want to turn that needle in moving forward on the affordability question. And certainly APC, those members of APC who struggled with this one, indeed said that if we do want to remove as many barriers as possible, owner occupancy, you would create one new unit, as opposed to a house with a suite would actually create potentially 2 new units as well too. And so it really comes down to that. There's not a lot of evidence with respect to speculation, and otherwise it really comes down to some previous historical connotations and how our comparison communities have kind of moved forward to kind of at least get it in. So it really is a housing policy question with respect to how much you want to move the needle. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wong.
I
Councillor
just,
Nay?
you know, for the record, I'm not going to be able to support this particular provision, and it has to do with similar reasons. Councillor Appleton just brought up that I think it does contribute to another barrier, and you know, the idea of having 2 rental units fulfills the larger objective of creating more housing options for people, and I really don't see, in terms of our community, our well-being, cohesiveness of neighborhoods, how whether you have a renter or a homeowner makes any difference to our neighborhoods and our community as a whole. I'm really more interested in addressing the issue of the housing crunch rather than perpetuating historical perceptions about what a renter's ability to be a good neighbor is all about. So I won't be supporting this one.
Thank you, Councillor Nay. I had Councillor Green.
Yes, thank you, sorry. I actually felt the same way that Councillors Appleton and Nay felt originally on this item, and then I attended the APC meeting and I listened to the conversation, and one of the younger members of the APC commission spoke very passionately about this and talked about the fact that owner occupation, in fact, she felt it would be a hedge against speculation. She also believed that owner occupation would prevent short-term rentals such as Airbnb, and certain types of VRBOs, which are vacation rental homes, as we all know. So I was actually persuaded by her arguments, and she is a younger member of our community, young family, would like a suite in her own home. And so I came away from that meeting after hearing that discussion and shifted my thinking on this. I agreed initially that I thought it was an additional barrier, but I do note that it was a popular and important item to our community generally. Owner occupation was favored as an option. And I think, as we've talked before, as this rolls out, as we implement the framework ultimately, if some of these things become problematic, and if owner occupation, for instance, poses any sort of barrier, I believe that can be reevaluated in the context of amending the framework. But at this point in time, I think, for the reasons I heard at the APC meeting from some of the members, not all, that's true, I did change my mind on this, so I do support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to speak once, and then I'll go back to you, Councillor Ney. First of all, I just want to point out, I think in my speaking with Councillor Zelka, he had raised the sort of conditional support of this motion, but would like to see us examine the idea of a sort of a master tenant kind of model where you could have one renter that's sort of held accountable as on behalf of the owner or something in that situation. So I'll say that. The other part of this is, I think this is always going to be the awkward part of having this discussion separate from the housing framework that's coming next year, because to my mind, a secondary suite is intended to be a sort of simple add-on to an existing home, and that's why that model is there. Having two rentals, configuring a house in that way is really where we're looking at providing dedicated rental stock and other things like duplexes where they're zoned and have that capacity. And the reason they're done like that is they're often revenue properties. And certainly there's been quite a bit written lately about this huge influx of commercial buy-up of real estate rental stock that is happening all across the States in massive ways, and now in Canada, particularly in Ontario, but moving its way around. And I think that if we're going to consider this as simple, add-on, inexpensive housing stock that has 80% buy-in from the public on the owner occupancy, I think it's a pretty important aspect for us to have that buy-in from the public, and also to put that bastion that we delineate between what is intended to be simple add-on housing into an existing home versus more dedicated additional housing, things like duplexes, carriageway houses, those sorts of housing options that we are considering next year. So I'm quite supportive of this personally. So I'll leave those two comments for myself and Councillor Zalka. Go ahead, Councillor Ney.
Well, I appreciate the concerns around this, but I'll just comment on a couple of the issues around. One is the fear that these homes with secondary suites might morph into an Airbnb operation. And the way I see that one is that would be dealt with a bylaw with it. Well, we already have a bylaw. We have no bylaw for Airbnb, and that simply needs to be enforced if that were the case. And as for, and I respect the concern around this upswing in commercial purchasing of real estate stock in neighborhoods and cities, but I'm not sure that can be mitigated with this particular provision. It seems to me that's a larger federal issue. That's my view of this. So those aren't concerns that factor into my decision. So I just want to comment on that, though I respect the opinions.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ney. I should also just point out, I do really appreciate the comments made. I think we have to be very careful not to ever use language that puts two classes of people who live here, right? There's no, home ownership does not dictate a better resident than a rental or vice versa, and I think we've just got to always be careful of that. So I think that point being raised is incredibly important as we have this conversation. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. And I do appreciate Councillor Ney and Councillor Appleton's comments and in this regard, and agree with many of them. But I do also, having learned through Mr. Wong's presentations, I think initially when the discussion on secondary suites started, I was having difficulty understanding the affordability because I was thinking of the affordability in the suite portion, and I didn't think that a secondary suite in Oak Bay would be a lot more cost efficient than in some other places. But then through Mr. Wong's presentations, I came to realize that the affordability came in to the discussion on the homeowner, and that echoes the discussion that we heard at the APC. And so if you look at the affordability impact from that perspective, then I like the idea of the secondary suite providing the opportunity for perhaps young families to get into housing in Oak Bay by having the secondary suite to help them with the affordability of the home. And so I am in favor of this. For that reason, I would like to do as much as we can, I think, as a community to aid younger families coming to this community, and having some of those helping dollars so that they can stay in this community. So for that reason, I am in favor of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Is there any other discussion on this item? Don't see any. So the motion as it stands is the recommendation in here, which is homeowner occupancy. Any other? So a vote in favor would be in favor of homeowner occupancy, and a vote against would be opposed. Let's just make we're clear on what it is we're voting on. So I'll call the question. Not seeing any other discussion. All those in favor? And opposed? Councillor Ney and Councillor Appleton opposed. So that carries. Thank you very much for that debate. And the fact that these issues are here, I think, reminds me that we're going to have to at some point, probably not too distant future, 2, 3, 4 years down the road, just have a little review and see how this is going and see how these rules are rolling out. Moving on, can I get a motion for the?
I'll move that either a secondary suite or a boarding use may be permitted within a single-family dwelling in Oak Bay.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Just for our clarification, Mr. Wong, perhaps you can just touch base on this. The word "or" here essentially means that it's either or. Is that correct?
Through your worship, that is correct. It is
Okay.
either or.
Thank you for that. Just so we're all clear about what it is that we're debating here. So that's the motion on the floor. Is there any discussion? Go ahead, Councillor Ney.
I don't think I'm going to vote in favor of this one either, and particularly given that we've just said that these are going to be owner-occupier dwellings, that I'm just imagining how this would roll out. So you have somebody who's, let's say they're living by themselves, a partner deceased, the kids are gone, and they have a suite downstairs to rent or in some part of the house. So they rent that, and then they've got 4 or 5 bedrooms, which a lot of houses in Oak Bay do, and they decide to take in a student out there. I don't see what the harm is, personally. You've got a home owner. You'd still have fewer people in the house, and I think it just provides an opportunity for increasing other kinds of housing within the community. So I don't see a significant risk given that we've got homeowner occupiers in the dwelling. So I'll vote against them.
Thank you, Councillor Ney. Councillor Appleton.
Well, thank you, Your Worship. I concur with Councillor Ney. We, in a housing crisis, I think we owe it to the broader community to provide as many housing options as possible. And I concur with Councillor Ney that one of the issues that I view in Oak Bay is a surfeit of very large houses that can accommodate many living spaces that really are, in a lot of cases, quite large for the amount of people that are occupying this space. And we've actually seen through our research and the information that we've been provided as council that this is the case in terms of occupancy of these buildings. So especially in a community that's situated so close to a major university, those boarding uses, I think, are really critical for the community. So I don't anticipate a problem. I concur with Councillor Nay's comments that I don't anticipate a problem having both boarders and suite renters in the same building. So I would vote against this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. I have Councillor Green.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and through you to Mr. Wong. Mr. Wong, do you have any wisdom on what the technical difference is between a boarder and a secondary suite renter? I mean, how are they differentiated legally or technically? Do you have any wisdom on that from other communities? Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship, through to Councillor Green. So the way the current bylaw is worded is that, again, the owner of a house may have additional renters, as Councillor Ney said, within the confines, sharing a bedroom, sharing the kitchen as a boarder. The secondary suite is classified as a separate unit, and so there are technically two units on that parcel: the primary unit and then the suite, which is a dwelling unit. And so that is I guess the definition from a land use perspective. And so so to Councillor Ney and to Councillor Green's question, yes, if and this was a bit the response from the community was a bit mixed, and so this is a good for council to discuss this. And at one time, I think we did discuss actually having both a suite and boarding uses, and so that would allow a suite and then the house, the primary unit, and then boarders within there as well too. There would be other regulations that would still need to come into play with respect to parking and others, but again, it does come down to how much of those barriers you want to remove and how much you do want to turn the dial. And so this was probably less than council may have seen in some previous iterations, but it is up to council to provide some direction as to where you want to go. So.
Thank you. Anything else, Councillor Green? No.
No, I'm sorry. Actually, I did second the motion, and now I'm thinking I seconded the motion for discussion. I'm glad that we had the discussion, and I may not support this motion as well, actually. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. I look forward to the rest of the conversation. Councillor Braithwaite and Councillor Patterson.
Thank you so much. And I definitely see the advantages of having boarders in the situations that both Councillor Appleton and Ney have spoken of. However, for me, this is one of the spots where I'd like to go forward in baby steps. So allowing suites first, having a look at how that is assimilated into our neighborhoods, and then perhaps then reevaluating and allowing boarders at a later date. I think that makes smart sense to me, to not go and do the whole McCoy first, but to go in baby steps and have the suites first, and then in a year or 2 years we see how that's going, and if we feel that the community can handle then having boarders as well, then I think we go ahead with boarders. So I'm going to be supporting the motion.
Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. And I'm wondering if Mr. Wong would just clarify for me that a boarder is defined as a person who is not related by family ties. Is that correct?
Mr. Wong.
Thank you, Your Worship. But through to Councillor Patterson, I would say generally yes. I would have to probably defer to staff who may have a copy of the zoning bylaw in front of them, how it's specifically defined in Oak Bay, but that general description is correct.
Thank you. 3 quick questions for you. This approach, or this rule, would this be written into the bylaw, or is this essentially a policy that's applied to the piece? I'm just going to get some sense of how easy this would be to adapt or change over time.
Through Your Worship, this would be written into the zoning bylaw as a permitted use or restriction of that permitted use.
So there would be in that case be an as of right once done, essentially. So if they had borders, they would be legal non-conforming if they changed the use. How does that work?
That is correct, Your Worship. Yeah. Until such time as that use changed or that use ceased for a period of time, then you would have to comply with the current regulations of the day.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Can you, and my memory is a little faulty here, should I read more details? What do other jurisdictions do on this front? Do most jurisdictions allow for concurrent borders and suites? Or do most jurisdictions do you have any, sorry, I'm making you look things up on the fly, which is not fair.
Okay. Thank you, Your Worship. I had this table from the report in front of me, and I was just trying to see which was which. Maybe, Your Worship, if there's any other questions, I can continue to look as you're asking.
Policy by law, jurisdictions. I had one other question. Now I can't remember what it was. Councillor Patterson, what was your last question?
Mine was just really defining, what was the definition of a border? Is it family? And nowadays that can be, I mean, that's quite broad sometimes too, because.
Yeah, sorry, I jotted down my first two, and now I don't remember what my third one was. So we'll.
On this, through Your Worship, on the second question, maybe I'll, if staff is listening out in interweb land, if they have access to the zoning bylaw and how the current bylaw defines borders. And I believe, like I say, I believe it is an unrelated person, but I would defer to that. And I am trying to look at the table with respect to borders and.
Well, Murphy's Law says you're not going to find it when you're looking
Probably
in a
not,
hurry,
yeah,
because it's
probably
almost impossible to find things when you're looking in a hurry. But I do appreciate that. Councillor Green, you had your hand up again?
Yes, I do. I just wanted to add a comment. I think in Oak Bay, somehow it's been interpreted a border has no kitchen. And I'm serious about that. I think that's the real differentiation. They have no access to a stove.
That is essentially true, yeah. So I guess I remember what my third question was on this one, because I think, again, looking at broad community support for things and those scenarios as laid out by Councillor Ney is, I think, exactly correct, that those are the sort of situations I think where we would like to have that ability to do that. Is there, if we have the ability to regulate users, is it possible to allow borders limited in some way, i.e. just to students, student borders, as opposed to a broader spectrum? Is that a possibility within a bylaw?
Through Your Worship, I would suggest probably not. The current bylaw does regulate unrelated persons, and that would be something that council would have to consider at time of implementation, but that's about the extent of the current regulation. But as far as kind of age limitation or students, I would suggest that that's probably not something that you would entertain in a zoning bylaw.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So Councillor Green, your hand is still up there. I'm assuming that's just left over from the piece before, so I'll go to Councillor Braithwaite.
Yeah, so just going on the allowing borders and secondary suites, I guess another one of my concerns, if we did that immediately, would be the parking. And the parking's coming up next. And so for me, if you have two borders that aren't students, as you've just mentioned, and even students, I guess, could drive, but then are we adding more parking into this as well? So that's why I really am leaning towards, let's do the suites first and then look at the borders after we see what the effect of the suites is over the next year or 2 years.
Any other discussion on this? Go ahead, Councillor Appleton. Oh, Councillor, so I'll go to Ms. Varela first, who seems to have an answer for a question.
Thank you, Your Worship. Staff has supplied the following. Boarding use means the sharing of the principal building as a single dwelling unit by the family of the owner or lessee with not more than two other unrelated persons, but excludes transient accommodation, separate suites, and independent accommodation.
Thank you for that. Sorry, Councillor Appleton, you were going to speak next.
Thank you, Your Worship. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to this again. I would just make the point that with respect to providing boarding uses, my view on that provision is that not allowing I feel that it's an undue restriction on somebody who has that dwelling unit if they choose to take on a boarder. And I would note that a lot of boarding uses are being employed for purposes of it. They are students. It provides a low barrier, low cost accommodation for students. Also, there are innumerable different boarding uses that are provided for charity and support purposes, for billeting of traveling, arts involved people, sports people. We had a boarder living with us from a local sports team, which was really great. So, in a lot of ways, the provision of a boarding space is actually can very well be a community benefit, and I would not want to unduly restrict somebody who wished to provide that community benefit by affording that boarding space. And I think, as we've discussed to a certain extent with regards to this, there seems to be some implication built into this, and I think that it guides some of the responses that we've heard, that people living in suites is a certain number of people, but I don't want to see any more people beyond that. That more people means noise, busyness, detracts from the neighborhood, and I don't concur with that. I think that more people means more neighbors and more people to get to know. So I think people are concerned with the volume of people, and I have to disagree, unfortunately, with Councillor Braithwaite on the parking piece. That there's often a perception that additional residents will automatically come with vehicles. And I don't share that view, and I won't speak to that further as far as the parking component comes into play. But I would like to see more neighbors. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Any other discussion? I'll go to Councillor Nade, then Councillor Braithwaite.
Well, I guess I'll just add to this discussion what shifts my thinking in terms of leniency around borders, to add on to what Councillor Appleton is speaking to, is that in Victoria, the vital signs report that came out not too long ago says that on so many accounts in terms of livability in Victoria, we get really high ratings on arts and culture, engagement, environmental sustainability, health, recreation, etc. But we get an F. I think it's a D- on housing. There is a crisis here. So opportunities that we have as a community to create additional housing options without creating an imposition on neighborhoods, I think we have to do that. I think we do that now, not incrementally. The housing crisis that we're experiencing in this city right now it's immediate, right? It's not to be dealt with in 5 years. So I guess the other logic of the border situation is, I know families in the community whose kids have grown up and they've got a couple of borders in there. So I don't really see the logic of how it's different that they've got a couple of borders there or a couple of teenage kids in the home. They're using the rooms now that have been vacated by their grown-up children. So in terms of pressure on our community or imposition on neighborhoods, I find this a very, very gentle way of creating housing density and housing options for not just our community but for the larger region.
Thank you, Councillor Nade. Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you, Mayor. And I'm just going to ask this question because I'm wondering what happens if we come to, I'm not sure exactly how everybody's going to vote on this, but if we come to a tie vote, and because we have one member missing, whether or not that would make a difference. And so if we think that's going to happen, would it behoove us to remove this one and have a more fulsome discussion when we have a full council in regards to this, or will that make a big difference? Because I'm not sure how Councillor Zelka feels about this, so he could go either way. I'm not sure, but just a question.
So procedurally, given that these are essentially binary questions, yes or no, I'm quite comfortable we should call the question. If it's a 4-2, then that carries it with or without Councillor Zelka. If it's a tie, I would suggest we just we leave that item for a later discussion. We can move forward with the balance of the policies, I think, on that piece. Unless Council at some point, because this is at the end of the day is a cumulative effect. We've had comments like because we have owner occupancy, we can do more on this side of the equation. I think those are real balances. So if at some point people feel like that's a critical piece to the overall puzzle, then we could defer the whole piece. But I think at this point, I'm happy to call the question and deal with it that way. Councillor Patterson, you had your hand?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the final suite study and some of the survey that went out to the community. So that was the most recent one. And according to a report done by Urban Systems, it does say that the majority of respondents, 56%, indicated that they would not be in favor of permitting both boarding uses and secondary suites. So while I do hear certainly the comments and don't disagree with the comments as offered by Councillors Ney and Councillor Appleton, I do look at the most recent survey and what the respondents to the survey said, and so that also influences my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Don't see other hands up on this one. I'm just going to just go back over a couple of comments because I think I actually struggle with this one a lot. I'm very borderline on this in terms of where I see that. I would like to know what other jurisdictions are doing. I think that's not a bad thing, but I will say the fact that it would be written into bylaw as an as of right piece makes me a little nervous. It makes it much trickier to kind of test and do and change it in future. Not the end of the world, but certainly one piece. I think the parking question is a legitimate one. It's true that all these houses were made for larger families and had a similar number of people in the past, but they're also were mostly made up of children, and the number of people driving and stuff were lower then. So at some point, it's always a sort of tipping point where you start creating problems on the street where you have a little bit too much. And I relate back to my time in Vancouver, and it was a lovely community, but it was very different because it was jammed with cars all the time. And I do agree that, and the same thing with the neighbors card, right? There's a certain density that has all your neighbors, and beyond that you stop knowing your neighbors again. And so we're kind of balancing that. And again, this is independent instead of as part of the housing framework, which I think diminishes the ability to kind of have nuance on this. But I think those are the things that weigh on me. On the other side of this equation, I will say I think the number of people uptake on borders is going to be very low. I think this is kind of a non-issue in many ways. Allowing it would essentially allow for those edge cases where people want it and have a need for it, or have a time in their life where they want to have some students around or something. I don't see a massive rush for people who can legally have borders now suddenly adding them in that don't currently have them. And there's as I think Councillor Appleton rightly pointed out, they're often kind of in passing, right? You have a friend of a family or something that comes to stay with you for a few years, and so I'm struggling on this one because I see not wanting to be too restrictive on it, but I also agree. I want to reflect. I think this is interesting when I think the 56-46-44 split of the community is kind of reflected here as well, that there's pros and cons. So I appreciate the conversation. I'm not sure exactly where I fall on this one. It's a borderline one for me. Any other discussion on this? Go ahead, Councillor Green.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I hadn't had a chance to say anything about this one other than to ask some questions. Upon reflection, I'm thinking about the comments by everyone, and I value all of them. But I was thinking also about some of our value statements, both in our OCP and in other documents. A sense of place, a sense of belonging, the importance of neighborhood, the importance of a sense of community. And I guess at the end of the day, whether you're a boarder or whether you rent a suite, the point is that you belong somehow, and that you are accepted, that you are a member of our community or a contributing member. And my concern about this is that it feels discriminatory, that we are discriminating between someone who lives in a suite and someone who doesn't. And I think at the end of the day, we have to be careful. I agree with your comments about enshrining this in any kind of bylaw or legislation. I think that is not something we should entertain. And I'm inclined now to agree with Councillors Appleton and Ney that this is splitting hairs, I think, and also with some of your comments that is this actually a non-issue? So I appreciate everyone's input. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any other discussion. I think this is going to be a interesting one as we go forward. And I think this might be one that we come back to at the end if there's still some things that we feel is in cumulative effect too much or too little. So I'm ready to call the question. The motion on the floor is that the boarding use may be permitted within a single family dwelling. So that's to allow the boarding use in a single family dwelling. And I'm happy to call the question. All those in favor? Oh, sorry, or, it's or, sorry, yes, sorry, or. I apologize. Uh-oh, that's a bad sign if I'm getting mixed up this early. So this is the or. So in favor and opposed, I have Councillor Appleton, Green, and Nay opposed. Is that correct? Nay, Councillor Nay, I saw your hand go up. So that fails on the tie. I think this is probably appropriate that we extend this conversation to include Councillor Zelka. I think this is one of those ones that's a bit of a boundary case. And I remain open to being convinced, frankly. I still, and in fact, what I might do is, in the interest of having that conversation, I might even pull this back up again when we have finished our overall deliberations, and if there's generally a feeling here that people want, that other aspects have addressed the concerns that have been raised here, then maybe we can have a look at it again. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Mayor, and I know it's not included in this, but I think this is one of the oddities I found in Sanach's regulations, that they permit only 2 kitchens. And my understanding of that is because the border use got a little out of control, and not only the borders, but the kitchens grew in numbers. And so, and that is one of the ways that Saanich got around it, was by limiting the number of kitchens. So, that's not an option on here, and I don't know that we want to consider it, but it does show that there can be some concerns in areas, particularly where you may be close to universities and things like that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for that point. And I think it's important as we sit here, and one of the things about Councillor Zelka is he lives up by the university and hears all of sees those issues in ways I think some of us don't necessarily. So I think that is an excellent point. So moving on then, so 1 additional off-street parking space be required for a secondary suite in Oak Bay.
I'll move that 1 additional off-street parking space be required for a secondary suite in Oak Bay.
Is there a seconder? Seconded, thank you. I'm happy to go for questions and or discussion. Go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you. I know that this one's going to be a bone of contention with some people as well, but my feeling on this is that I would rather, again, start with something that we can change in the future. And I know that it has been a suggestion from the information that we've received that there could be a variance option that would remain for council to make special consideration on a case-by-case basis. So for me, and based on what I've heard from the public and read in the surveys, I think it would be it would be good to ask for at least one parking spot per secondary suite, and then have the ability to vary on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I will be supporting this, and in fact, I noticed that now under the Districts of Saanich's sustainability program, they've gone a step further, and so that their new regulation says that the second parking spot must have energized outlet for electric vehicle charging. And I think this is what really, for me, made the secondary parking spot something that I considered important, because if you look at BC's target for by 2026 is 26% saturation of electric vehicles and 90% by 2030. And the one thing that I do note in areas of Oak Bay now are extension cords stretched across the yard and onto the street. And, you know, we can look at certainly things, and perhaps there will be those who say parking spots aren't necessary and whatnot, but nevertheless, there is a reality of a changing world, and we are now caught in the interim where not only are we seeing right now more vehicles, but we're going to electric vehicles, and there's a mandate to go to electric vehicles in this province and certainly even in Canada. So certainly through this transition period, I feel that the extra parking stall is required, and I even support going as far as Salish does in requiring that the outlets be provided for the parking stalls too.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Councillor, do you need a hand? Oh, Councillor Green.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. And through you to Mr. Wong. Mr. Wong, not to put you on the spot, but can you give any further clarity or information on how a parking spot may be a further barrier to existing homeowners? I'm just wondering, are you aware of any other situations? I'm sure there are many where existing homes in Oak Bay that have suites now may not have off-street parking. How would that impact them in terms of being able to continue?
Thank you, Councillor Green. Mr. Wong.
Thank you, Worship. Through to Councillor Green. So if memory serves, and I'll stand to be corrected, the current zoning bylaw for the District of Oak Bay, or actually the parking bylaw, actually requires 2 off-street spaces for a single-family dwelling. So this, if somebody wanted a secondary suite, they would actually have to provide 2 + 1, so 3 off-street parking spaces. They could be tandem, so that would be something to be considered. But so that was the barrier that APC had identified. What is the impact of actually adding that 3rd parking space to support to legalize and support a secondary suite, and what is the impact on impervious surfaces, on the tree canopy, and on landscaping? So that was their concerns.
Councillor Green.
Yes, thank you. Just quick comments on this particular item. I did a survey on my own street, actually, of the number of vehicles that are parked on the street, but also have off-street parking available to them. And they actually all park on the street. Now, these are homeowners, and these are homes with no suites. And the average number of vehicles for the homes in my block are at least 2, and in some cases 3 vehicles. So I find this interesting that Oak Bay, I don't think Oak Bay enforces that bylaw now. I don't think they're forcing homeowners onto their lots to park in their 2 spaces. So I'm just wondering, are we creating, again, another barrier to having a secondary suite if, in fact, the homeowner has to provide 3 off-street parking spaces? And secondly, what will that do to the green space, to sustainability, to climate action mitigation, and to, as Mr. Wong mentioned, tree canopy? So those are some of the big issues for me. I know that parking is a concern, but we have suites now, and I'd be interested to know how many complaints there are about parking in Oak Bay at the moment. And further, I would like to know how many homeowners are parking on their property now in the two spaces that they're supposed to have for a single-family dwelling according to our parking bylaws. So those are some of the burning questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. I have Councillor Ney and then Appleton.
Well, I don't think I'm going to vote for this one either. And this is my reason is not only, of course, as in the report here shows that I think the APC said this, is that by providing on-site parking, we're using up green spaces, taking down more trees. But the real concern for me around this is the idea, there's 2 pieces to it, is one, instead of disincentivizing car use by providing an on-site parking space, we're in effect incentivizing car use for the potential user of the secondary suite. And it just seems to me there's other more creative schemes here that that could be done that would actually disincentivize car use by requiring, for example, if somebody has that extra car, let them park on the street. Most streets in Oak Bay can take that extra car and charge them. Have the tenant pay a premium to take another parking stall on the street. Now, I'm just throwing that out. A whole program would need to be thought through. But the other issue, of course, is that if we require on-site parking, the person that's going to end up paying for it is the tenant because of increased cost to the homeowner. So that would roll over to the user of the secondary suite. So thereby possibly increasing the cost of housing for the person. But my main issue is that I think there's an opportunity here around this program to address the whole parking issue in this community. And I think there's an opportunity lost right now by doing the status quo and providing on-site parking without really taking seriously the way we're likely incentivizing increased car use. Now, if this does go down the route of on-site parking, if that's the will of the council, I do agree with Councillor Patterson that should be in tandem with a requirement for an electric output for the vehicle on the site. But as it stands right now, I'll be not supporting this feature of the program.
Thank you, Councillor Nate. Councillor Appleton.
Well, thank you, Your Worship. And just could not agree more strongly with Councillor Nay's comments about incentivizing driving. Providing ample free parking incentivizes driving. And when we are in the middle of a climate emergency and a declared climate emergency in the District of Oak Bay, incentivizing or encouraging private automobile use is incompatible with a climate emergency. And things, even steps such as electrification of cars, electric cars are not the definitive solution to a climate emergency. Mode shift in transportation is the response to a climate emergency. And I think it actually lines up extremely well with a common complaint about parking in Oak Bay, which is concerns about congestion, about parking on streets in Oak Bay, and the nature of Oak Bay streets just being narrow and being confined and not being able to accommodate very many cars. And there's a very good symmetry to that because a good portion of Oak Bay, especially the southern portion of Oak Bay, was designed as a streetcar suburb where people did not use private vehicles. So the very reason that the congestion appears on the streets is because the streets were in fact not designed for that many cars. They were designed for people using more sustainable modes of transportation. And so it is, in effect, self-perpetuating in that respect. The potential reduction in impervious area and an increase in impervious area and a reduction in green space on private properties that would be brought about to accommodate the parking requirement is unacceptable to me under a climate emergency. I think we as a culture and as a larger, broader community need to evaluate how we consider the use of public space and the storage of private property on public space. I definitely concur with Councillor Nay's comments that if extra parking was required, if somebody was to occupy a suite and felt that they absolutely had to have a car to do their business, then there should be the requirement to pay to occupy public space with your private property. So I am not in favor of the additional parking requirement, Your Worship. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. I will step in here since everybody has spoken once. First, I'll have to reflect Eric's comments to me. He was very clear he did want to see parking included on the site. I am torn on this one because I think I can see zero mechanism by which, if we require parking spots as part of a suite requirement, that will actually have people coming forward. And I see the drive to get people to register and to know where people are living, to that portion of it, the actual use portion of it, not so much the building of it, but the use portion, to be paramount to success for this piece. So I can't see most people, frankly, and just investing that much money up front to comply with the bylaw, especially if they have an existing suite in place. That being said, I do think that there are significant potential issues of parking on the street. I like, Councillor Ney, your piece of that. I was wondering if there was a mechanism by which, we can do a sort of a soft test of this, where we require that the parking be there, but we put a moratorium on that requirement for 2 or 3 years, and then allow for that variance request to come. Or if we see that the overwhelming majority are going in without problems, we can change that bylaw to go back down to not require that, to give it sort of a test period. I'd like the idea of having a pay model where basically you sort of, kind of like businesses do, if they don't have adequate parking on site, they can provide a little extra to kind of help cover the cost of street parking. But of course, that doesn't give them rights to that street no matter what. So I think there's some pieces that have to be worked out there. But this seems to be one of those ones where the answer seems to be conditional on the policy piece of it as much as it does on the implementation aspect of it as much as it does on the policy. So, my firm preference here is to have that requirement, in there, but not enforce it and see how it goes. And I think one of the benefits of going through that variance process is, so 2 or 3 years down the road, and when we look at it, if people want to apply, that would be the place that we could put in the requirements. Say, okay, you can do that, and that's acceptable, but that would require that you do wire it for electrical vehicles to make sure that your existing spots are prepared and so forth. So this one is tricky for me because I see both sides, that there is a massive barrier to people coming forward if we implement it, but at the same time, it's one of the few incentives we also have for people to say, hey, we can save you a lot of money here if you come forward and provide these other attributes that would benefit the community, looking at that. So I guess, Mr. Wong, I'll just ask you, is there any mechanism by which we can, in this course of this discussion, sort of say, we'll go down this policy but defer it, or go down this policy but look at payment options in lieu, or other pieces that we can kind of tease out at a later date?
Through your worship, I'll start and defer to staff for any additional comments. If it is a policy that you're looking at, then yes, that is council's prerogative to explore and change. Once it becomes a bylaw requirement, then like you say, that like if it was a bylaw requirement, if somebody came in for a brand new building permit on a brand new house, they would have to comply to those bylaw requirements. And so I think that the non-enforcement of that would be challenging for sure. But if it was a policy, certainly it's something that you could consider. As far as time limited, that is something that other communities have considered as well too. And so that usually aligns with some form of a registration process if you register within that first year, so we're starting to then we're starting to thread a whole bunch of other components together, but it really, it comes down to that implementation piece. So, but if it is a strict bylaw requirement under the parking bylaw, then that would have to be applied to for anybody who comes in and applies for. And so your point about it being it would not incentivize people to come in and legalize their suite, I would concur with that. But anybody who comes in with a new application for a new building would have to comply to that 2+1 parking if that was in the bylaw. So, but I'll defer to staff if there's any additional comments about the implementation of that.
Thank you, Mr. Wong. Ms. Rella?
Thank you, Your Worship. So just wanted to confirm, as Mr. Wong stated earlier, that the current bylaw requires 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit, one which must be within a building, and an additional parking space is required for each dwelling unit serving a boarding use. So that's your current bylaw at the moment. If council provides direction to require parking tonight, we could bring back future governance decisions around the ability for electric cars, if there's a phase-in process. So again, we can tease some of those apart, or council can deliberate further at a future date.
Okay, thank you for that. It sounds like it's possible, but the mechanisms for how we get there is a little unclear at this point. So I appreciate that. I guess I'll, it's interesting when we did the survey and the OCP and I think even the current survey reflected this. There was sort of this, yes, we support suites, some absolutely no conditions, some absolutely not at any condition, and a lot with, as long as you sort of thought about these issues like parking and green space and things like that. And I think this is going to be one of those ones where it falls into that. Have you thought about this enough to make sure that you're not disincentivizing people to come forward, you're not tearing down trees to put in a parking space, but you're not clogging up the streets unnecessarily because you're just unwilling to put in a parking spot to deal with the number of cars on your lot. So I think that's the funny balance that we have to have here. So I'm not sure how that would even get worded, frankly, now that I've heard the answer back from Mr. Wong in terms of the bylaw. I'll just leave it at this point and go back to Councillor Green for a second time.
Thank you, and I'll keep my comments brief on this issue. I think it's the parking bylaw that we may want to look at for some revision and review of the parking bylaw. I don't know when it was last looked at, but on this particular issue, I think times have changed quite drastically since that bylaw was written. Not all houses have the ability to park their cars inside the home or under the home, so there are some issues there. And the other issue I think that we've talked about is street parking, but that could be handled by a permitting system. So very much like when you have residential only parking, and those people who live on the street have to have a residential only sticker, so or a resident sticker. So that's one way of handling it for one vehicle only, and restrict it that way. But I think doing it this way, I would rather not restrict it initially and then test it that way. And so start with the positive to encourage people to come forward. And then if parking becomes an issue, then look at how we might change it. But I also think the parking bylaw should be looked at. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. Go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite and Patterson.
Thank you, Mayor. And one thing I did want to say before was that I think that for existing suites that we should look at deferring the requirement for parking by, say, 1 or 2 years. And if they then can prove after 1 or 2 years that there's no issue with parking from their suite, which there probably hasn't been because their suite's been there for however long already, then they could get a variance application and not have to have a parking spot. So I think that would be something that could be considered as well, or that I would like to see as well.
So you're saying leave it as 2 spots for existing homes and 3 for new builds in your preference, okay? Thank you for that. Mr. Wong, I just want to make sure we're all, again, I'm going to go back to the very first question asked here by Councillor Patterson in terms of existing versus new. When we're talking about existing, we're talking about existing homes, not existing suites. Is that correct? So these are the regulations of a 1947 bungalow. If someone wants to put in a suite, the zoning requirements, et cetera, apply to that. The age of the house, we're not giving, I just want to make sure that's the existing that we're speaking of.
Through your worship, that is correct. It's the BC Building Code applies to an existing building.
Right.
For that Division A, brand new builds for on a vacant lot, that would be Division B.
Okay, thank you. Sometimes we talk about, like, well, we already know how existing suites are working, but a lot of these would be existing houses that might consider a new suite in them. So I appreciate that clarification. Councillor Patterson?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Interesting discussions on parking for myself, who predominantly walks or takes public transit. But and also, I know I'm not in a winter city because everybody parks on the street here, and in winter cities they do park in their garages. But I think what I would very much like to see, and Ms. Varela said that the policy could be adjusted to look at some conditions. Certainly, I would think that any homes that we have in the district that are designated heritage homes that have suites, I think that we would definitely accommodate those. You know, some of them do have suites already, and if others wanted to come forward and register as having a suite, I think certainly for all of our heritage properties, there would be a variance permitted so that they would not have a requirement to have that parking spot. But I also find it interesting that we even talk about fees so that people could pay for a parking spot on the street. And for many streets in Oak Bay, and certainly around the area that I live, I think people forget that the streets are also the sidewalks. And so it really depends on the circumstances of where you live in Oak Bay. If you have streets with sidewalks, then I think that, you know, saying, well, great, put the cars on the street and charge them for the parking, it sounds wonderful and probably would work well. But the streets where the streets are actually sidewalks, because there's no sidewalks in the neighborhoods, it creates quite a dangerous situation, actually, for pedestrians, for children that are, you know, learning to ride bicycles, out playing. And so I don't have the same perspective that our streets are solely for cars. They really are a transportation mode, and that's not just for vehicles with wheels on them. It's also for foot traffic. So I just would like to remind everyone of that. I don't want to just put everything out on the street and not consider pedestrians. And I find more in our society, particularly here in Victoria, our sidewalks are becoming deplorable. And you know, I think we have to consider foot traffic also. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other discussion? So we've had some ideas mooted about here in terms of some compromise or things. Councillor Braithwaite, you pointed out the possibility of a differentiation between older homes and newer homes in terms of the pieces. It is, or heritage, and so I think, you know, there may be some, if there's anybody wishes to test an amendment to change this, we can certainly do that. Otherwise, I'm just going to call the question as it's laid out here. And we can test it first and then try other options if it doesn't succeed.
Okay, I can try. It might sound something like this, that I would move that we would defer by 2 years any requirement of off-street parking for an existing secondary suite, and that we not require off-street parking for heritage buildings that have secondary suites.
It could. So I'm just, you're suggesting an amendment to this recommendation so that, I don't know if we can defer that. I think from Mr. Wong's point, I don't know that we can have a motion to defer the implementation of the parking piece of this. So Mr. Wong, maybe I'll just get your direction on that.
Through your worship, the language would probably be you would make the effective date of that bylaw or that regulation. You can actually specify a date in which that piece of that regulation became effective on whichever conditions that you state. So if we were here for fourth reading today, you would then make certain clause effective November 16th, 2023. So depending on what that looked like.
Okay,
So 2 years from the date that the secondary suite bylaw would go into effect, something like that.
I'm just trying to keep track of what the motion is, so apologize here. So one half of that is to essentially make the implementation of this rule to 2 years.
From the date of implementation of secondary suites.
There was a second part of your motion as well? Oh, a heritage.
And to forego the requirements of an additional parking spot for heritage homes that have secondary suites or will have secondary suites.
Okay. That's moved. Is there a seconder for that wording? Councillor Patterson seconds that. So this is a motion to amend the wording here to change it to additional parking space be required to basically to additional parking spot basically required with implementation 2 years after bylaw begins, and essentially foregoing a requirement for additional parking on heritage homes. Is that your understanding, Councillor Patterson? So I just want to make sure that we're okay doing this in this structure, because we're sort of, I know we're sort of bridging a little bit of the what and the how here a little bit, but I think we're trying to find a model that might have some support. Go ahead, Ms. Varela.
I'm just wondering if the intention is for requiring parking with a new suite. If you wanted to use the language out of the report, which says one additional, as an option, and relating to public response, that one additional off-street parking space be required for no suites, or for new suites, but no additional parking space be required for existing suites or heritage homes with new or existing suites within a 2-year period from implementation of the bylaw.
I think that works, except for the heritage piece, I think needs to be taken out, because I think that it would be a variance. Oh, then it would come back as a variance, yeah, okay.
So can you just read that again to us, Ms. Varela?
With the heritage piece removed, Your Worship?
No, leave it in as you said. So you're actually adding in something else that Councillor Braithwaite spoke to but didn't include in her motion, which is the differentiation between new and existing buildings. So can you just read that, what you said again?
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your patience. That one additional off-street parking space be required for new suites, but no additional parking space be required for existing suites or heritage homes with new or existing suites. And then you could link it to a time period.
I would just point out if it's not required for existing homes, then heritage homes would automatically be existing homes. So okay, so we're blurring the line here between existing homes and existing suites, because we have differentiation of bylaws on existing homes and existing suites.
The question taken to the public then, if we remove the heritage homes, 62% indicated that one additional off-street parking space be required for new suites, but no additional parking space be required for existing suites within a 2-year period. You could also perhaps link it to the requirement for registration, but I'll look to Mr. Wong if he wants to speak to that.
Could you have that waived for suites registered in the first 2 years, Mr. Wong?
You could consider that for certainly, Your Worship. I think your distinction that you were raising was an important one, in that you may have a vacant lot, and so then somebody comes in with a brand new house with a new suite. So that's a new house with a new suite. You may have an existing house currently with no suite, and then they want to then convert their basement for a suite. That one would fall under Division B of the Building Code, but it may or may not fall under the parking regulation. And then you may have an existing home with an existing unregulated suite that they want to then come in and legalize that suite. Division A of the Building Code would apply, and then, as Ms. Varela said, you'd then have to interpret what that would be. So thank you for that distinction, specifically with an existing home with currently no suite that they want to put a suite in versus an existing home with currently an unregulated suite. So that's an important distinction for sure.
So if I'm...
And then you could tie a license or a registration process to put a timestamp on that for sure. So thank you, Your Worship.
So existing homes with a suite registered in the first 2 years essentially would be exempt from the parking requirement. Is that sort of how I'm reading that?
Through Your Worship, if that's how council would like to propose that, then that could be something to be considered.
Okay, I'll go back to the mover. So we've kind of, it's always the problem making motions on the fly, but I think as long as we understand what the intent is here, we can find wording. So the intent, just so I'm very clear here, the motion would be essentially to amend this to still require the additional parking space for new homes, which of course could always ask for a variance, but they'd be required for new builds. All existing homes that register suites within 2 years would be exempt from the additional parking spot. Is that so? Okay. And okay. I think that's fairly clear. Any other discussion on that, Councillor Braithwaite? Since okay, I think we're reasonably clear on that. So that's the motion. The motion is to amend it to include that. So we're speaking to the motion to amend at this point. Go ahead, Councillor. Go ahead, Councillor Green.
Oh, thank you very much. I just have a couple of questions for clarity. I'm sorry, I was trying to follow that. So when you talk about new suites, are you talking about new suites in new homes and new suites in older homes? And when you're talking about heritage homes, are you talking about registered and designated? So those are just some questions for clarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. I'll just interpret what I heard here as the intent is that all existing buildings that register a suite in the next 2 years are exempt from the parking bylaw. And the heritage was actually now, I think, essentially left off of this because they would be an existing building. And if they're going through a heritage process, would probably apply for a variance in any case. So that's where the motion is right now, to amend it in that way. Is that clear?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else want to speak on the amendment? Councillor Appleton?
Just very briefly, Your Worship, I'm in opposition to the amendment because I'm not in favor of the original motion that it's amending. So just for clarity, thank you.
Councillor Ney?
Similarly, the way this is going is, I mean, I don't agree with the incrementalism, for one thing, around, addressing GHG impacts on the environment around and not encouraging, trying to find a way here to incentivize car use. The problem I have with this amendment is that, so you're going to exempt people if they register within 2 years, but after that, then they're going to be required to put the on-site parking. So we're back to so we're back to incentivizing car use on the property. So it doesn't, with the 2-year constraint, I could possibly consider that existing homes be exempt and new homes have an on-site parking. It's not ideal for me because I think it should be across the board, but with the 2-year thing, it doesn't resonate with my concern around incentivizing car use with this program. So I'm against this.
Thank you, Councillor Ney. Councillor Braithwaite?
I think, though, to Councillor Ney's point, I think that the point would be that after the 2 years, they could come and ask for a variance, and if there have been no complaints or anything about parking, then council is well within their purview, or they can change the bylaw at that time to say there has been no issues, so we're not going to have an expectation that you have off-street parking. That's how I look at that. So the council of the day in 2 years can make that determination. So it would mean that if I had a suite in my house and I registered it, I wouldn't have to have that parking for 2 years. After 2 years, if there's been no complaints on my street from my suite, I can come to council and say, I would like a variance. There have been no complaints. And council could then say, that's fine. And the council of the day, if that's what they choose to do. And in 2 years, to your point, Councillor Ney, I think things will have moved along quite a bit in 2 years, and things might be very, very different than what they are now. And the council of the day might just say, no parking spots required. I think that's kind of where we're trying to get to, is we're almost on the same page, I think, but there's just that one little niggly thing, I think, for you. So I hope that helped explain it a little bit.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Patterson. Go
Just
ahead,
in
Councillor Nay.
response, so the status quo,
Or
right?
Councillor Braithwaite,
Yeah,
sorry.
that's right. I think I knew who you meant, so it's okay. I got that. The status quo right now is no on-site parking. And so I would rather start from where the status quo is, and if it becomes problematic, then let the council the day ramp up the parking, because it sends a very clear message about what I thought that this council is trying to do, is to dissuade people from using cars and encourage them to use other modes of transportation. So I would flip it around, and if you need a provision to increase on-site parking because it becomes problematic, then let the council that day upgrade it to that based on the complaints. But I think it's unfortunate that we're not using this as an opportunity to really, we're in the climate crisis here. So on housing, the time is now, and on opportunities to reduce carbon emissions, the opportunity is now. And we're sitting here with decisions around how to, the architecture of this program, with opportunities both to increase housing options and reduce carbon emissions. And it's hard to let that slip by for me right now.
Thank you, Councillor Nay. I have Councillor Appleton, then Green, then Patterson.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just wanted to concur again with Councillor Nay. I really appreciate those comments. I think that this, and I think that the debate on this point reflects the larger topic of what action the district will take in order to action the climate emergency that the district itself has declared. So in my view, the default setting, the baseline setting, should be to disincentivize private car use, not to incentivize. And I think it's important to reflect. For me, I listened to the conversation, and I listened to, obviously the way that it's viewed in the community. I think it's important to reflect on the accommodation or the lengths to which historical planning practice and historical implementation goes to accommodate the storage of vehicles and the accommodation of private cars. And such an accommodation and such a dispensation is seldom provided to other modes of transportation or anything else other than cars. So I concur with Councillor Nay as far as I would like to see us set the standard and set a strong standard, take this opportunity to set a strong standard to disincentivize private car use. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Councillor Green, and then Patterson.
Yes, thank you. And this is a complicated conversation. I would use the word complicated for the current motion. I think and I appreciate the sentiment, but I actually think status quo is a much simpler approach, and I would agree with Councillors Appleton and Nay on this. Furthermore, I think the administrative complication and the enforcement complications and variances and 2-year wait lists and who's heritage and who isn't, and I think it has real potential to be a very, very complex and complicated situation trying to enforce like this. Or trying to regulate like this. And I do believe the status quo is the best option at this time. And as others have pointed out, if in the future there is an issue, address it then. But I think by doing it this way, we're creating more issues, frankly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Green. Councillor Patterson?
We got through the first bullets quite quickly. You notice it's always the parking. It's always the parking, and I really understand what Councillor Nay and Councillor Appleton are saying, and I applaud the sentiments, but I do keep in mind how long it has taken this community to get to secondary suites, and the hesitancy of over 50% of the residents in the district about the program. And I think the motion Councillor Braithwaite made was in fact, is trying to find the best of both worlds. It is trying to incentivize people to come forward on their suites, and then I think that's the objective, is to get the suites program. And we're hung up on the cars, but it's really to get the suites program in, and to get a buy-in from even those who are hesitant. And while I appreciate it would be great to disincentivize car transportation, I also feel compelled to listen to those who feel strongly, and often because of the number of vehicles that are on their street, that they want a phase-in period and they want some protection. And if, as other members of council are saying tonight, there isn't a problem with this, then the policy can be changed in 2 years to respond to the non-problem. But I'm also trying to seek a balance of comfort for people who in the community, and there are many of them who are hesitant around this, and hopefully demonstrating that we're also listening to those people and trying to find the balance between the two. So I support the motion as it is, and I think we have to listen to both sides of the community.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other discussion? Councillor Green, your hand is still up, but I think you've spoken already. So so on this motion, just so I'm absolutely clear, we're looking at a motion that one additional off-street parking space be required for all new secondary suites, and effective 2 years from the date the bylaw comes into effect, that additional off-street parking space would be required for existing secondary suites. It'd be a 2-year layoff of that. And further, that no additional parking spaces, right, for secondary suites within heritage homes is that piece. That's, sorry, Ms. Williams drafted up the wording a little bit more clearly. So, okay, so that's the motion, is to amend it for nuance to cover those pieces. I have to say I'm inclined to support the amendment, because I think it's certainly better than the existing motion. So I think I'm going to just say I'll support that motion, because I think the motion as it is, that an additional off-street parking space be required for secondary suites, I think is too much and will have a negative impact in terms of uptake. So I'll support the motion to amend, and then that will be the main motion. We can have a further discussion on that if that passes. So the motion to amend to include that nuance of the one immediate for new and 2-year deferral for the old and heritage exclusion is live on the table. Is there any other discussion on the amendment?
Could you read it again?
Sure. So the amendment would essentially change it to read that the one additional off-street parking space be required for all new secondary suites. That's essentially what's there now. But would be changes that effective 2 years from the date the secondary suites bylaw comes into effect, an additional off-street parking space be required for existing secondary suites. So essentially defers that implementation by 2 years. And for that, no additional parking spaces be required for secondary suites within heritage homes. And I take Councillor Green's point that would have to be fleshed out and defined in terms of what is heritage. But from a policy direction perspective, I think that's sufficient at this point. That's the motion. To amend it to read that. Okay. Any other discussion? So we're not voting on this as a policy. We're voting on whether to amend the original, which is all have one additional to have this slightly different and more nuanced approach to it. So I'll call the question on the amendment. All those in favor? And those opposed to the amendment? Councillor Green, Appleton, and Nay. So that fails. So we're back to the one parking space for all, one off-street parking space be required for all secondary suites in Oak Bay. Any other discussion on that or change or suggested amendments? I'm really struggling here. I got to say, I think that we have some obligation to build in incentives to people to come forward and register, and I think this is one mechanism by which we have that. but I don't think that we need a parking spot for all suites in Oak Bay. So how do I support that in this discussion? I don't know. Go ahead, Councillor
I mean,
Braithwaite.
to me, it's again, this one is one where we need a full council to be discussing this, because we're very split on this, and we tried one way to come to a solution. It didn't work, so it's just a very difficult position, because I don't want to some of Councillor Patterson's points, I don't want to lose sight of how the public feels about this. Even taking all of the comments from Councillor Appleton and Ney and Green into consideration, I mean, we do have cars on our streets right now, and we will have cars on our streets for the next little while. So I think we have to have some accommodation for this. I will be still voting for this, even though I would like to see it. I would have liked to have seen it in a different way that we put on the table. My hope would be that we can take this, that this again will fail, because it seems like it could be three-ish, but that we have a discussion when we have a full council at the table.
I might suggest one other effort at an amendment if people are interested in trying, and that would just to simplify it, that just separates the new and the old. So existing houses don't have a requirement for an extra parking spot, and new ones do. I appreciate that doesn't address there's going to be a significant parking impact from existing houses, but the uptake is less rapid in new houses or existing houses, because they have to do considerable work to bring them up to speed. So that would be another option if people are interested in making an motion along those lines to carry it. But I think I see your point. We may just have to wait for Councillor Zelka to come here and have this piece. But I do see it as key to the overall puzzle, because I think, again, kind of like the owner occupancy, things are okay without it and with it, and some other things are affected by the parking piece. So yeah, go ahead,
I
Councillor
mean,
Ney.
that would be a compromise I would be willing to support without the time limitation, because it sends the message, at least to a portion of the community with existing suites, existing homes, that we're making an effort to not require the on-site parking and therefore disincentivize car use. So if I was a homeowner and I wasn't being required to put that on-site parking and they can't park, then I'm probably going to choose a tenant who doesn't have a car. That would probably the decision that I'd be more likely to make. So the issue with new builds and requiring the parking is, I presume that they can have a double garage to take care of two of the parking stalls, correct? And then
I think new homes have a lot more flexibility of
Yeah.
adapting their land.
Yeah.
Most of them are essentially making space for, most of them have a garage and a long
Yeah.
driveway at this point, which
It's
would
not-
meet the bylaw
yeah.
anyway.
It's not sending the message I would like to be sent, but at least you'd be sending it with a large number of existing homes. So it is something I'd be prepared to
Sorry, just
reconsider.
Well, just before I go, I was asking this question if it's, you don't want to make that motion at this point. Okay, thanks. Councillor
just for
Braithwaite.
clarification, would that mean that existing suites would then have to pay for like I get a permit for parking on the street? Is that what you're suggesting? That they don't have to have a parking spot on site, but they would have to have a parking permit?
That's how I would design it, yeah.
But I think those are nuances that would come from the piece. So I think we run into the issue of we're essentially giving direction on bylaw, and so the bylaw wouldn't be contingent upon paying. It would be you'd have again as a right to a parking spot or not have a parking spot.
I'll throw the motion out then. Can I try it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so I'd move that, that we have no on-site requirement for existing home suites, but one on-site requirement for new builds with secondary suite.
So
I'll
be a-
second that.
So it's a motion to amend the current motion to that effect. Okay, thank you. Do you want to speak any more to that? I think we're pretty clear on what that means.
It's a compromise solution, because if it goes the other way, then we've got nothing. So, but the part that I do like about it is that it does create an opportunity for a significant number of homes in this community to abide with the philosophy of disincentivizing car use. It doesn't for the future, but a future council could change that as we get further into this climate crisis. They may find that that's something that they can do. So, so as I say, it's a compromise. It doesn't fully support my values and the principles that undergird that, but it's one that moves us forward, I would say, significantly along that philosophy.
Thank you, Councillor Ney. Any discussion on the amendment? Go ahead, Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship. I understand the intent of the amendment, and I appreciate the efforts being made to come to a compromise type of solution. I wouldn't be able to support the amendment unless it was coupled to a mandatory fee structure for vehicles associated with existing secondary suites in existing buildings. So, as what has been discussed here, I don't want to corral staff at this stage of the game because it is going into an operational component. Obviously, it has some significant, wide-reaching resource implications as to how that might be accomplished. So that's not something to do on the fly. But unfortunately, without that commitment in place, I can't support the amendment.
So before I go back to you, Councillor Ney, for the matter of this meeting, just to get through sort of the intent and worry about the mechanisms later, because we've talked a lot about this in terms of bylaws. I can't see how we could do a bylaw that allowed it and then require payments. But if we make a bylaw that requires it, that gave us the variance with options for a step down with compensation or requirement for electrical parking. Is there any guidance that staff could give us in terms of if that's the intent to have some kind of additional controls on that over time or compensation or whatever from a structure perspective, or can we leave that with the intent captured and when we look at the policy, that'll give it some of the more of the nuance of how we go about it? Ms. Rella?
Would it be appropriate for council to direct staff to bring back a staff report on this? Because there is a lot of nuance to it. If we could get the general guidance that new builds have a parking requirement and existing doesn't, then we could bring back options related to possible registration, timelines, sort of incorporate some of the nuances that we've heard tonight, as well as do some research about other possible options. If the matter is big enough that council would be most comfortable with the staff report, we're happy to bring that back to the table for you.
Thank you, Ms. Rella. Go ahead, Councillor Ney.
I personally would appreciate that because, I can see the challenge we have as decision makers working within certain. It's a silo issue, right? Whereas this is we're talking about a way of carrying out a program that has implication not just for housing, but for climate change issues. So now we're talking parking plus zoning and housing issues, and it does require an integration and thinking more holistically about how this can come to be. So I appreciate the offer from staff to consider the issues that are part of this discussion. So yeah, it's favorable to me, but I'm not sure if it does to others around what that. So if we ask for a staff report, it's still in our hands to say yes or no when it comes back, presumably, Mr. Mayor.
In fairness, everything we're giving here is direction to develop policy to come back for council direction, because there's a lot of nuance in that implementation. But the clearer we can be about what we're trying to achieve out of this, I think is the more helpful it is. So if there's clear direction here, no, we don't want any more parking spaces, or yes, we definitely want parking spaces, that's very simple. I think the nuance that we're getting into here might benefit from okay, so we want to achieve these goals. How do we actually get there from a policy perspective? I think that might make sense, because I'm hearing willingness to compromise here a little bit on both sides of things. And I think we can't forget the fact that we do want to incent people to, not disincentivize people from implementing suites. And so making it complicated, making it expensive, making it, those things are all very serious problems to overcome. So, but at the same time, we give up our opportunity for creating incentive on the other side if we don't create some rules that give us some leeway to give relaxation if they're doing the right things, right? So I think that staff report to me would make a certain amount of sense to come back with that, to tease out some of these nuances. But I'm going to go around the table. Councillor Braithwaite, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I would just like, if we are going to go the staff report route, then I would like the consideration of the former motion put in there as well, to have information about that in there as well.
Which is really just tied to, is there a time-based thing? And maybe I would agree with that, but I would suggest maybe we look at it a bit more holistically. Like if people come forward and register a suite in 5 years' time, do they still get that 2-year leeway, or those other options there that kind of give that some incentive to do that? So, Councillor Green?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I would support this motion, and I would just ask two things. One, that we have a return date in mind for this issue. Secondly, that if staff would look at the permitting angle as well as I described it, and what other communities are doing adjacent to us, including, the city of Victoria, Salish, and Esquimalt. I would be interested in what they're doing as well on the parking issue. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Green. I think so that with the motion, if it seems to be a reasonable acceptance from here, just to refer this for additional staff information to come back to council. Is that wording acceptable, Ms. Vrella?
Yes, Your Worship, and we'll tease out some of the discussion that we've heard tonight.
Do you want to make that motion to refer it back to staff, Councillor?
Refer it back to staff.
To staff to come back with a staff report on the issue of parking. Moved and seconded. Any discussion on that? Don't see any. I'll call all those in favor. Opposed? None. Councillor Appleton opposed. That carries. Thank you for that offer, Ms. Vrella. I appreciate it's nice to resolve these here, but sometimes we just need to have a little bit more peace. No, the motion that was on the table, well, there was a motion to amend that was moved and seconded, but we're just referring the whole matter now to that whole motion as amended, essentially, to staff. But so there was a motion, just for clarification of process, there was an original motion made, there was a motion made to amend it, and now we've had a motion to refer it to staff. And that's the matter, which is the original motion plus the amendment, which the amendment hadn't been called at that point. So, but realistically, we're just asking for staff to give feedback on the question of parking and some of the discussions held here. Okay, so then
I'll move that enforcement of secondary suites should be through a complaint-based program in Oak Bay.
Moved and seconded. Are there questions or comments on this? I have a fundamental question on this that I need a bit of clarification from Mr. Wong, because I see there's two aspects of enforcement. One is the enforcement of the use, and there's the enforcement of the bylaws, and obviously there's health and safety questions there attached to, is this suite actually safe? And so if someone's doing that, then we would normally do an inspection. If we're aware there's a suite in place, then we would do the normal inspection for bylaw. That's not really complaint based, but there's the other portion of it, which is, I think there's an illegal suite, or I think there's something going on there that's a problem, and that would be more complaint based. So do we have to divide this a little bit between the sort of the bylaw, building permit kind of building code question and the use, or would this all be encapsulated through a complaint based program?
Through your worship, with respect to health and safety, I think this attribute covers that. I think the corollary to a complaint-based program would be kind of a direct, kind of active enforcement, and I think that was the difference between kind of more of a reaction versus active. And so I know that the building department, the fire department do go out and advise on health and safety, whether it's complaint-based or on an advisory basis. And so I think that would cover that under how it's currently worded.
Okay, so those pieces would still be in place as required by law for code compliance, et cetera. This is really more of the, we're saying we're not going to go out and hire additional bylaw officers to go out there and be proactive in terms of looking these up.
Your Worship, that was the intent of the discussion.
Okay, that helps a lot. Thank you very much, Mr. Wong. Any other discussion on this piece? I don't see any. I will call the question then. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. Thank you.
I move that basic health and safety standards should be met for existing suites based on the alternate compliance methods. Division A and full BC Building Code compliance should be required for new suites in Oak Bay Division B.
Moved and seconded. Is there any other discussion on that? Go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you, Mayor. I just, again, with the word existing, I just want to ensure that we know what existing is. Is that suites that are in place now in houses or if somebody has a house that's a 1940 house and they build a suite in 5 years, is that considered existing? Or is it just suites that are actually physically built right now in houses?
Should that wording be changed to suites in existing homes? Mr. Wong?
Through your worship, thank you for that. I'm just looking actually in the appendix as provided in the report, and I may need to maybe suggest an amendment based on Councillor Braithwaite's comment. I believe the building code was changed so that Division A could be applied for existing buildings, whether it had a suite or not. And so I think, for clarification, Councillor Braithwaite, I think you were suggesting if you had an existing house that had an unfinished basement and then they wanted to create a legalized suite, would Division A apply? And if you give me 30 seconds to review it, I believe that was the intent of Division A. And so the way it is actually worded, if that is the intent of council, to allow somebody with an existing house with an unfinished basement to then create a suite using Division A, this isn't quite worded that way. So it would be good to get a bit of direction from council from that.
Is that the intent, Councillor Braithwaite, that it would be existing homes?
Yes.
Okay, so then the wording should really be for suites in existing homes based on alternative compliance. I think that would suffice for the direction to staff. Is that sufficient, Mr. Wong?
No, through your worship, just for clarification, so the Division A applies, it says changes to alterations to existing buildings to add a secondary suite. So it is based on the premise of finishing an unfinished basement and dealing with the hardships that may exist when working within the confines of an existing home. So we would actually, if that is council's wish, we would actually remove suites because it would be for existing buildings and whether or not it has a suite or not. And so if somebody wants to come in and legalize an existing unregulated suite or build a brand new suite in an existing home, that was how I believe the building code is currently worded to apply Division A.
That makes sense up to the point that someone might build a house and then not to currently and then come back 6 weeks later and say, I have an existing house, I want to only deal with. So I just want to make sure that does that go on in perpetuity, or is it at a certain timeline that kicks in? I think the intent here is very clear. Let's leave the details to the pieces. Yeah, so we're just essentially agreeing that we're going to apply the allowances provided within the Act to apply Division A to existing homes and Division B to new builds. I think that's the intent here is very clear. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other discussion on this motion? Well, then I'll call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. And then the last.
And I move that a registration program be utilized for tracking suites in Oak Bay.
Moved and seconded. Councillor Nay?
So I'll be interested what others speak to, but right now, how they speak to this issue. But I think the way I see this right now, that a registration program, I think, is simply onerous, expensive, and contributes to yet another barrier for the uptake of this program. And I guess from what the comments that are made, it's for collecting data. So the review we received from Mr. Wong, there was only one jurisdiction, that was Vancouver, that had a registration program. And yet others were able to monitor and provide data. And I suspect they do that through their building permits, which would be one way to sort of monitor the uptake of secondary suites, so that at least you could count whether the program is being successful in that respect. And then with respect to health and safety, we've already agreed that it will be a complaints-based program so that health and safety can be addressed in that way. So yeah, I just think this contributes to being another barrier, so I'm not, I'll be interested what others say, but right now, I'm not sure I'll support this attribute.
Thank you, Councillor Nay. Councillor Patterson?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. And I see the registration program as not just being to track data. I do actually see the registration program as being the trigger to monitor or at least inspect for safety and health in existing buildings. And I feel very strongly about the health and safety standards issue of the secondary suites. And so there may be suites that actually don't take out a permit to do anything. But at least if a registration program would in my mind at least, ensure that suites that were registered would be checked. However, and I'm sure that staff will come back and give us information on what that implementation might look like. And if a suite, if there was a complaint about a suite and it wasn't registered, then again, at least the requirement to register to keep the suite would ensure the health and safety issues. So I feel strongly about that. I also think that, and it might be covered under a separate issue, but we haven't talked about it, is that I would like to see that some way within this framework that the accommodation must be a tenancy under the Residential Act, i.e. not short-term rental.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Any other discussion on this item? Go ahead, Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I appreciate the concerns raised by Councillor Nay, and I share those. In this particular case, I support the registration program, mostly with respect to the collection of data. I guess I was really struck through the process that the district went through as far as preparing our housing needs assessment, where it was clearly identified that secondary suites were one of the main or a significant rental component in the district, but that very little information was known about them. And it was very difficult to scope the nature of secondary suite implementation, for want of a better word, in the community. And that was impairing our ability to really speak to the comparative impacts and how those things were rolling out in the community. So I'm fairly practical minded about the realities of the uptake of that registration system. I know other communities have struggled with the registration system, so I'm not starry-eyed about the ability to get everybody on board, but I sure would like to get a better handle on the current state of affairs with secondary suites so we can judge uptake over time, new implementation, those kinds of things. And I think that that's, in a community like ours that is primarily built out and rents a lot in association with these single-family residential buildings, I think we kind of need that data. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Councillor Green?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Sorry I'm slow with this mouse tonight. I just wanted to add comments to previous council members. I will support this motion because I do believe that we accomplish things like increased health and safety standards, enhanced protection for tenants, from discriminatory and mistreatment practices, enhance quality control and monitoring. And I think those are all important things. And I think if you read public comments, people are looking for some safeguards. I think registration provides that. An interesting conversation at the APC about registration. There were the words mandatory or voluntary suggested, and APC members agreed that they felt, they call them trigger words, that it would be better just to have registration rather than mandatory or voluntary. Just have a registration program that is more neutral and that may be more of an incentive in that respect. So I will be supporting this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. Any other comments? I'll just say a couple of pieces on here because I think this is probably ultimately going to be one of the ways that we see success or failure of the program is how we implement a registration program. I agree. We should have one. I think how we do it will make a big difference. I appreciate the danger of the compulsory versus or mandatory versus voluntary, but at the end of the day, we're going to have to make it one or the other in those pieces, and I think we'll see where that lays out. I guess what I would ask in the development of a registration is that we think of it in terms of how do we not allow a registration to become a disincentive for registering. So what are the costs attached to that in a way that makes it punitive? And I just want to reflect what I have seen in this community in my time here with suites, and that is that they're transient often. So people will move into a house and they will fix up their basement and have a suite for a while, and then they won't, and then maybe they'll have a grandparent move in, and then they won't, and then new people move in, and they won't have. They will use the basement for their own use for a while, and so I guess whatever we're doing here, if we're registering it for use, so that we're not. Again, if we say, oh, you have to pay us because you have a suite in your basement, but it's not being used, that seems like a disincentive to tell us about it. Whereas if you're actually registering it for use and managing that, then you can apply reasonable cost adjustments to that. Say, okay, you've got more people living in a separate suite. Maybe we charge you an extra couple hundred, 500, whatever that is, a year for a garbage pickup, et cetera, that's attached to a new dwelling unit. But that's easily covered by the additional rent. But you're not so those are sort of thoughts that I have in this registration, because I think that, and again, from a health and safety perspective, we want people to sort of say, we want first responders to know if there's people living in a place in a basement in a separate piece, as opposed to just that one might exist. And so I think there's a lot of reasons to tackle that from a use as opposed to just a build perspective over time. And I think that would allow us that ability to have a much higher uptake in the registration portion of it. So those are my thoughts on it, but I certainly support the motion that's sitting in front of us. That is a registration-based approach to things. Councillor Green, you wanted to speak again?
Yes, Mayor, I had some remarks on suites, and I wondered if I could share those with my colleagues very briefly.
Well, I think I want to call the question on this question sorry, I've lost my spot here. On the registration program, and then I'll take some general comments before I go back to the main motion, which is to move most of these aspects that we should agreed to forward. And there's two items that still have to come back to this table for further discussion that I have in my notes. So I'll just call the question if there's no more to the discussion on this piece on the registration. So the motion is to approve a registration process. Go ahead, Councillor Ney.
Just one final comment. It looks like this is going to go in the direction of being a registration program, but I just want to concur with your comments, Mr. Mayor, about, from my perspective, so that this does not impede uptake of the program, that it really, a lot of attention be paid to avoiding a highly regulated type program that becomes prohibitive for the uptake of the program. And exactly what that means, I'm not sure, but I'm sure we'll get that information from staff. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ney. I think I think the complexity we want to avoid if possible on this. So any other discussion? I don't see any, so I'll call the question. All those in favor of registration? Any opposed? None opposed. That moves forward. So obviously work to do still on the nuances of that, but appreciate that. So by my notes, and I'll get staff's correction on this, we The boarding use sat undetermined at this point, and the street parking is going to have a staff report that comes back for consideration. So at this, before I go to the first motion in that list was to sort of, endorse that moving forward to staff to develop the policy based on what's been heard here. I certainly think general comments are in order, and if anybody wishes to, on the totality of this, say that, hey, I might think differently about something because of all the other pieces that have been implemented, this would be the time to have that discussion as well. So, Councillor Ney, you had your hand up.
Well, I did. I don't want to. I know Councillor Green has some general comments, but this is kind of more specific. It's up to you, Mr. Mayor, but I don't know if she was before me or not.
Well, we're sort of in the general area, so why don't I go to Councillor Green first, and
Okay.
I'll go to you, Councillor Ney. Go ahead, Councillor Green.
Okay, thank you very much. And I have to say, I'm really gratified by what this council has done tonight. At a time when housing is suffering critical shortages and limited supply, escalating costs for both purchase and rental, and a need to more fully address OPE's role in a regional housing strategy, I believe that creating more possibilities for housing affordability, stability, and security are really important. I supported the regulation of secondary suites over the past 10 years as a significant first step in a broader housing plan for Oak Bay. And I know this council, that is the goal here. I believe it's time to finally create a culture of acceptance in our community for tenants who live in suites and for homeowners who have suites. It is not acceptable that in Oak Bay, homeowners with secondary suites and their tenants have lived in what I call the shadows and have found themselves on the margins of what is considered legitimate rental housing. We are one of only two municipalities in the region that has not permitted secondary suites. We know that Oak Bay has hundreds of existing suites that are considered illegal because they are not regulated or permitted. I think the time, though, for turning a blind eye to this form of important rental housing stock in Oak Bay, excuse me, I'm choking here, is behind us. And I thank all of my colleagues and you, Mayor, and staff for their leadership, and Mr. Wong. I think this is a really important night for the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. Any other, just go ahead, Councillor Ney, and then Councillor Patterson.
So, one of the issues that hasn't come up as we've considered the architecture of this program, that they do in some other jurisdictions, and I think it addresses the issue of the citizen that a renter is in our community. And that is the provision of outdoor space access to the user of the secondary suite. So I know they do this in Victoria, that there's a requirement for a certain amount of outdoor space that's made accessible exclusively to the user of the secondary suite. And I think it's a big deal, personally, in terms of for the user of the suite to be able to access outdoor space and connect with people in the outdoor space helps to make that citizen a part of the neighborhood. So you're not just going into an enclosed space and then into your car or whatever you do. That there's this experience of the outdoor part of the built environment that the user can connect with, both nature and with other neighborhood folks. So I don't know how that would happen, but I'm just wondering if it's something this council is open to entertaining as a requirement for as a part of this program.
It's a very interesting question, Councillor Ney, and one I hadn't thought of before. I'm not familiar with that piece. Do you have any knowledge, or can you share with us sort of the real world impacts of that requirement? Like, do they get a sort of a fenced off part of the yard or part of the front yard, or what does that look like?
Usually what happens, the ones I've seen, at least in Victoria, and Saanich, is that the outdoor space is often either fenced off or by using sort of bushes and trees outside the door, the entranceway of the suite. So that becomes their outdoor, often it's on the side of a property, because that's usually where the side entrance comes in. And so they get that space, you know, the 15 feet or the 5 feet, 10 feet, whatever it is. And then to the, from the front to the back of the property. But there's different ways that, this has been constructed on properties, and I don't know the exact regulations around the amount of square footage that's required, but I do think that's specified in Victoria's bylaw, from what I understand.
I think it's a really interesting point. I have a feeling we're going to come across a few other little odds and ends of ways that we might make this more successful on those little sort of nuanced ways. Because these will all come up against the, well, how much of a barrier is that, et cetera. But perhaps we might ask Ms. Varela, can we build into this as we start dealing with the, now that if this passes as it goes forward, and we move that along, can we build into that process of that nuance as we're going into these policies to create a space for those kind of ideas to come in and be part of that? Because that's much more granular than what we're talking about today, but it's totally valid. And I think if we can make those little nuances that make the suites and the residents more part of the community, we should take every opportunity to do that. So can we just create some space in the process to have that discussion?
Absolutely, Your Worship, and staff is flagging the nuances as they come up, so those aren't being lost. Thank you.
Is that satisfactory, Councillor Ney, that we create a placeholder for that discussion? Because I think it's an important one.
And just my summary comments, just to build on, if I may, Mr. Mayor, really, you know, when I first got on council back in, long time ago, okay? Hazel, when was that? 2009 or something. But I remember very quickly this issue coming up. And it was the most prickly of issues. It may have been more prickly than the deer issue, I'm not sure. But it was like when council got before the public, it's just like you felt like you were, you know, on a firing range. It was really, really tough for the community to move this forward. So, but we're here, and I think my experience of talking with people in the community, even those who have been very vocally against certain features of this program, when I've conversed with them more recently, I've heard them say, I'm not against the program. People aren't against this anymore. Whereas in days gone by, they really were. It's been the nuance that we've wrestled through this evening that has concerned citizens. I think we've come to some good decisions that will work for this community, and I think there will be the uptake and the buy-in. And I really appreciate you know, what all my council colleagues have brought to this, and the diversity of perspective that has, I think, made this will be a very successful program and contribute in a significant way to expanding the housing stock and the diversity of housing options that are so badly needed, both in this community and the larger region.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ney. Are there any other discussion before we get to the main question? Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. And just, I know Ms. Varela said that the staff are keeping notes, and I just want to ensure that in whatever policy is written for this, that I feel very strongly that it must be written in that the accommodation be a tenancy under the Residential Act, because short-term rentals are something that I don't think we should encourage in this community. And then I trust that after some of the policies are written, and going back to Councillor Appleton's statement about performance and how we do on this, I'd look for an action impact criteria analysis of what's reasonable, you know, what is reasonable to track, as well as what the implementation framework is, because the devil is still in the details and we haven't worked them all out yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Any other comments? Councillor Appleton?
Thank you, Your Worship, and I appreciate Council's indulgence tonight as we discuss the issue of parking and the issue of transportation. And I've been fairly vocal on this issue, but I do want to point out that irrespective of the gigantic issue, the significant issue of providing housing options, which secondary suites addresses, which is significant and extremely important. It's also a discussion about sustainability because of where the district is located, so close to the downtown core and so close to amenities, significant features, facilities like University of Victoria. We have a strong capability of providing housing options in a way that allows us to move towards sustainable transportation options, to incentivize and provide the rationale for things like increased public transit service, these kinds of things. So not only are we looking at a housing option thing here, but the secondary suites in a very real way, because of where we're situated, contribute towards sustainability, and they drive other sustainability aspects like active transportation and just the compact built form. So I appreciate the discussion around that, and I do think there's kind of a double win here. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Any other discussion before I'm called the question? Sorry, we actually don't have a motion on the floor. Is there a motion? So the motion would be essentially to, so I'm going to go back to the...
I think it's to endorse the draft guiding attributes as presented in this staff report, excluding, I guess, the two that we have.
As moved tonight.
As moved tonight.
Yeah, because there's two that haven't gone
Okay.
through.
So I'll start again. That council endorse the draft guiding attributes as moved tonight from this staff report to guide policy development in support of implementing a secondary suites program in Oak Bay.
Second.
I'll second that.
Moved and seconded, thank you. And just to make sure that actually does encapsulate the fact that these other things are coming back to council. There's no additional motions required as we did those in the stream. Is that fair? Ms. Williams? Sorry to interrupt. No, just procedurally here, we have a motion to endorse what's been passed here, but we have two items that are going to come back to council. We don't need an additional motion to say, okay, good. Just making sure we're covering our procedures here. Go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite.
And sorry, just one thing I thought of was, I guess that I don't remember seeing anywhere tonight or speaking anywhere tonight about having only one secondary suite in each unit. So I'm just wanting to make sure that that's still what our thoughts are, is that there can be no more than one secondary suite in a house.
No, fair point. Mr. Wong, is that built into the definition of a suite, or does that require some additional direction?
I think staff can take council's direction, but I believe if it's in the RS, which is one family residential, that would be the direction that staff would take. So only one per building, correct? Yes.
Okay, thank you. Any other, so we have a motion now, moved and seconded as it is. Any other discussion? I'm going to keep my comments very brief on this. I think I very much appreciate the process undertaken. I know some people still are against suites. My experience has been much like Councillor Nay's. When they say no, it's often no, well, unless. And so I think this process we're going through of the community input and this discussion around this table is to try and find, I always find this is a diversion of council. If we can kind of grudgingly agree on a path forward, we'll probably have the same result from the committee or the community. And I think we're a long way towards that right now. There is still a lot of devil in details, absolutely, to make this a success, but I feel very positive. And for anybody who's watching, who's wondering why we haven't asked, the yes or no question on this, it is in the OCP. But I think more importantly, suites exist in our community, and they're regulated essentially by danger or by sort of people calling and complaining about things. And that's not an appropriate regulation in the long run. And if we really want to have people part of our community and look at sustainable housing options, we really do have to look at a different regulation model than we have currently. And I would just put out there as well, I think this addresses one housing form that is really important. I think anybody expecting this to suddenly add 1,000 or thousands of new houses in the community is probably wrong. I think most suites that want to be there exist, but it will allow for that growth as people want them. It'll provide that forum for it. But I also want to just put a plug in the work. We still have a lot of work to do on the housing framework. That'll address a lot of the other questions and discussions here today about other housing forms that will also provide address the housing needs that we are very well aware of. is still to come, and I think that's very important work as well. So I just want to express my appreciation to all the thoughtful discussion here tonight. It's always these are hard sometimes, but they're important discussions to have. And I'm very pleased to see this. Hopefully, it will pass, and we'll move it forward to the next stages of the implementation. Any other discussion? All right, I will call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That will move forward. However, we have more work to do. So thank you very much for your time on that. Councillor Appleton?
Your Worship, do we have to move to receive the report as well?
Yeah, we should do that as well. So
Then I will
move
move to receive the staff report.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. And I believe,
Move adjournment.
yes, moved and seconded. Thank you very much. Any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? None opposed. That carries. Thank you very much. Mr. Wong, thank you so much for
Yes,
all of your
thank
work
you.
on this. Thank you for your careful and thoughtful work and answers and time. So I should have said that before we adjourned. Maybe you can just add that into the minutes as my appreciation. Not an easy thing to do, and so we look forward to. We'll continue this work obviously without you at this point. So thank you for everything that you've done. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night, Councillor Green.
Selena, thank you.
Recording.